The Academy's weakest F rank just cleared Hell Mode. Manhwa recap. Full script. The morning sun cast its golden light across the spires of Ars Magna Academy, a fortress of knowledge and power that stood as the pinnacle of human achievement. For centuries, this institution had produced the strongest mages, the most feared warriors, and the legendary heroes who shaped the fate of the continent. Its halls echoed with the footsteps of prodigies, its training grounds burned with the flames of S-rank talents, and its very walls seemed to pulse with the accumulated mana of generations of excellence. But for Kang Jae-Hyun, the sun brought no warmth. He stood in the center of the main courtyard, surrounded by a sea of students who watched him with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. His uniform was standard issue, the same navy blue jacket, the same silver buttons, the same crimson trim that marked him as a student of the combat division. But pinned to his chest, where others displayed emblems of B ranks or A ranks, or the rare, coveted S-rank insignia that glowed with latent power, his own emblem bore a single, damning letter. F. It flickered weakly, as if even the insignia itself was ashamed to exist. F rank, the lowest of the low, the designation given to those with mana pools so shallow they could barely light a candle, the rank that was supposed to be a formality, a theoretical category that no actual student had occupied in over 50 years. Until Jae-Hyun. Professor Min stood before him, a scroll of eviction notice unfurled in her hands. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Jae-Hyun had spent 3 years learning to read the micro-expressions of those who looked down on him. He saw the flicker of relief in her eyes. Finally, after all this time, they would be rid of the embarrassment. By order of the Academy Directorate, Professor Min announced, her voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority, Kang Jae-Hyun is hereby stripped of his dormitory privileges, his meal credits, and his access to the central training facilities. His continued enrollment is under review pending a disciplinary hearing regarding his failure to meet minimum academic standards for 3 consecutive semesters. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jae-Hyun heard the whispers, the same whispers he had heard every day for 3 years. 3 years and still F rank, pathetic. Why doesn't he just drop out? He's wasting everyone's time. I heard his mana pool is smaller than a child's. How did he even get accepted? The laughter that followed was sharp, like breaking glass. Jae-Hyun kept his face blank. He had learned long ago that showing emotion only made it worse. When he had first arrived at Ars Magna, filled with hope and ambition, he had believed that hard work could overcome any limitation. He had trained until his body broke, studied until his mind blurred, and prayed to kings he didn't believe in for just one spark of progress. But the F rank never changed, never wavered, never grew. He was a statistical anomaly, a cosmic joke, a living reminder that the Academy's sacred ranking system was not the meritocracy it claimed to be. Some people were simply born worthless. That was the lesson Jae-Hyun had learned over 3 years of humiliation. He accepted the scroll with both hands, bowing formally even as his fingers trembled with rage he could not afford to show. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "I will vacate my room by evening." Professor Min nodded, already turning away. "See that you do. The Directorate has been more than patient with you, Kang. Perhaps it's time to consider other paths in life. Not everyone is meant to be a mage." She walked away, her high heels clicking against the stone like the final ticks of a countdown. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded for the morning. Most didn't spare him a second glance. Why would they? He was nothing, less than nothing. An F-rank ghost haunting the halls of a school meant for kings. But one pair of eyes lingered. Jae-Hyun felt the weight of that gaze before he saw its source. Standing at the edge of the courtyard, partially obscured by the shadow of a marble column, was a figure he recognized immediately. Professor Alara Vane, the Academy's youngest master of illusion magic, a woman whose beauty was as legendary as her ruthlessness. She wore her silver hair in a severe braid, and her eyes, pale violet like diluted wine, were fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She smiled when their eyes met. It was not a kind smile. Then she was gone, vanishing into the crowd like a mirage dissolving in heat. Yi-Hyun's hands tightened around the scroll until the parchment creaked. He didn't know why Alara Vane would waste even a second looking at someone like him, but he had learned that attention from the powerful was rarely a blessing. He turned and walked toward the dormitory district, his footsteps heavy on the cobblestones. Around him, the academy continued its daily rhythm, students practicing combat forms in the training yards, merchants hawking enchanted trinkets from stalls along the main avenue, professors lecturing on advanced mana theory to classes of eager young minds. A world of color and life and power that had never once included him. His dorm room was on the 4th floor of the low-estrated building, a cramped space barely large enough for a bed and desk that he shared with 3 other students who had long since made it clear they wanted nothing to do with him. When he arrived, his roommates were already there, packing his few belongings into a worn travel bag. "About time," one of them muttered, a B-rank named Sung-ho who had once been friendly back in the first semester before Yi-Hyun's failure had become contagious. "We need the space for someone who actually belongs here." Yi-Hyun said nothing. He gathered his meager possessions, a change of clothes, a textbook on basic mana theory that he had memorized years ago, a worn-out training dummy that he had used until its enchantments failed. Everything he owned could fit into a single bag, which was fitting, really. An F-rank didn't deserve to accumulate possessions. He was at the door when Sung-ho spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Yi-Hyun, what are you going to do? You can't go home, your family." "My family," Yi-Hyun said flatly, "made it clear 3 years ago that I was no longer their concern. They have a new heir now, an A-rank." Sung-ho had no response to that. The door closed behind Yi-Hyun with a soft click that sounded louder than any explosion. He walked through the academy grounds without direction, his feet carrying him past familiar landmarks. The central library with its towering shelves of grimoires, the combat arena where he had never once won a match, the administrative building where his future had been decided by people who had never seen his face. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost like fire. That was when he felt it. A vibration beneath his feet, so subtle that most people would have missed it. But Yi-Hyun had spent 3 years hunting his senses to compensate for his lack of power. He felt the tremor, felt the way the mana in the air shifted, flowing toward a point in the distance like water draining into a sinkhole. He followed it without thinking. The tremor led him away from the main campus, past the training grounds and the faculty quarters, toward a section of the academy that was marked on no map he had ever seen. Ancient trees grew here, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost meaningful. The path beneath his feet was worn smooth, but the undergrowth was thick, as if no one had walked this way in decades. And there, nestled in the shadow of a cliff face that should not have existed according to the academy's geography, was the entrance. It was not a door, it was a wound. The portal pulsed with a light that was not light, a darkness that was not darkness. It hung in the air like a tear in reality itself, and around its edges, Yi-Hyun could see the faint outlines of something vast and terrible waiting beyond. The mana emanating from it was so dense, so potent, that it made his teeth ache and his bones hum. A sign stood beside the portal, carved into a slab of black stone. Hell mode. Difficulty, impossible. Survival rate, 0%. Clears 0. Beneath the warning in smaller letters was a date, 3 years ago, almost to the day. The portal had been here for 3 years, hidden from the student body, waiting. And Yi-Hyun realized, with a clarity that cut through his despair like a blade, that this was why they had kept him. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of being the academy's joke, 3 years of being stripped of everything piece by piece until there was nothing left. They had been waiting for someone, with nothing left to lose. Behind him, he heard footsteps. He turned to see Professor Alara Vane standing at the edge of the clearing, her violet eyes gleaming in the portal's strange light. "You found it faster than we expected," she said, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. "I suppose even an F-rank can have moments of usefulness." Yi-hyun's hand tightened around his bag. "What is this place?" Ilara's smile widened. "A solution for both of us, really. The Directorate has been monitoring this dungeon for 3 years, waiting for the right candidate. Someone whose death would raise no question. Someone whose existence was already a failure." She gestured toward the portal with a delicate hand. "Go in, Kang Jae-Hyun. Die in there and your family will receive a letter of honor. Your name will be cleared. Your failure will become a noble sacrifice." "And if I refuse?" Her smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes grew colder. "Then you will be expelled by morning, stripped of your rank. Your name erased from every record, your family disgraced. You will become nothing, less than nothing." She tilted her head. "But you already know what that feels like, don't you? You've been nothing for 3 years. The only question is whether you want to die as nothing or die as something." Yi-hyun looked at the portal, looked at the impossible darkness swirling within it, looked back at Ilara, who watched him with the patient anticipation of a cat watching a wounded bird. And for the first time in 3 years, Kang Jae-Hyun smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had been stripped of everything: his rank, his family, his dignity, his future, and who had finally, blessedly, run out of reasons to be afraid. "You're wrong," he said quietly, "about one thing." Ilara's eyebrow rose. "Oh, I'm not going to die." He walked into the portal before she could respond. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the last thing he heard was her sharp, startled gasp. The first time, perhaps, that someone had surprised her in centuries. The world dissolved into chaos. The Hell Mode dungeon was not a place. It was a concept made manifest, a realm built from suffering and despair, where the very air was poison and the ground was made of broken bones. Yi-hyun fell through darkness for what felt like years, his body breaking and reforming, his mind shattering and rebuilding itself over and over, until he wasn't sure where the dungeon ended and he began. But he had spent 3 years being broken. He had spent 3 years learning how to survive when survival seemed impossible. He had spent 3 years being forged into something that the dungeon had not anticipated. A man with nothing left to lose has no fear. A man with no fear has no weakness. He fought kings how he fought. Against monsters that should have destroyed him 10 times over, he fought. Against traps that should have torn him apart, he fought. Against the dungeon itself, which threw everything it had at him in an attempt to break the insolent F-rank who dared to challenge its perfection, he fought. And 1 month later, when the final boss, a creature of pure darkness and hunger, crumbled to dust beneath his bleeding hands, Kang Jae-Hyun stood alone in the heart of Hell Mode and knew that he had won. He felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked away since birth, sealed by hands he could not see and powers he could not comprehend. The chains that had bound his potential shattered like glass, and for the first time in his life, he felt the true depth of his own mana. It was not a pool, it was an ocean. It was not a flame, it was a sun. And as the dungeon began to collapse around him, as reality itself seemed to shudder at what had just occurred, Kang Jae-Hyun walked toward the exit portal with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had already faced death and found it wanting. He emerged into the clearing exactly 1 month after he had entered. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of Hell Mode. The portal behind him closed with a sound like a final breath, sealing itself away forever. Yi-hyun stood in the morning light, his academy uniform torn and bloodied, his body scarred and changed, his eyes no longer the dull brown of a failure. They glowed now with an ancient crimson light, the mark of a monarch, the sign of a power that had not been seen in this world for 1,000 years. He looked up at the spires of Ars Magna Academy, at the fortress of power that had cast him out, at the institution that had tried to break him. And he smiled. The F-rank was dead. Something far more dangerous had taken its place. They had sent him into hell expecting a corpse. Instead, they had given him an army of one, a power that had been sealed since birth, unleashed at last, a purpose that had been denied to him for 3 years, burning in his chest like a second sun. Kang Jae-Hyun had returned. and the academy would never be the same. The first thing Jae-Hyun noticed as he took his first step back onto academy grounds was the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a world holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had stopped blowing. Even the ambient mana that usually thrummed through every corner of Ars Magna seemed to have frozen in place, as if reality itself was waiting to see what would happen next. And then the window appeared. It materialized in front of his eyes, translucent and shimmering with a light that existed somewhere between silver and gold. Unlike the status windows he had seen other students summon, clunky interfaces of blue light that displayed basic statistics and ranking, this one was different, elegant, ancient. The letters that formed its words were not the standard runes of the academy, but something far older, far more powerful. The forgotten Monarch's ascension. System initialization complete. User Kang Jae-Hyun. Status Monarch sealed right arrow unsealed. Previous rank F artificial. Current rank. Warning: the seal placed upon the user at birth has been shattered. However, remnants of the seal remain active within the Academy's monitoring systems. To outside observers, the user will continue to register as F rank. Recommendation: conceal true power until the remnants of the seal can be fully removed. Premature exposure will alert the faction responsible for the seal, a faction within the Academy's Directorate. Jae-Hyun stared at the words, his crimson eyes narrowing as the implications sank in. Artificial. His F rank had been artificial. 3 years of humiliation. 3 years of being treated like garbage. 3 years of watching his classmates surpass him, of hearing his family disown him, of believing that he was fundamentally worthless, and it had all been a lie. Someone had done this to him. Someone had placed a seal on him at birth, a seal designed to make him appear weak, to trap him at the bottom of the ranking, to ensure that he would never realize what he truly was. A monarch. The word echoed in his mind, stirring memories that weren't quite his own. Visions of ancient kings who had ruled before the current system of ranks existed, mages so powerful that they had shaped the very foundations of magic. The monarchs had been the first mages, the ones who had taught humanity to harness mana, who had built civilizations that made Ars Magna look like a child's toy. And they had all been destroyed, erased from history, replaced by the ranking system that now governed every aspect of magical society. Jae-Hyun dismissed the window with a thought, watching it dissolve into motes of light that faded into the morning air. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his face remained calm. He had learned in hell mode that showing emotion was a weakness, and he had no intention of being weak ever again. He walked toward the academy's main gate, his torn uniform drawing stares from the few students who were awake at this hour. He saw their eyes flick to his chest, to the cracked F-rank insignia that still hung there, and he saw the familiar contempt in their expressions. But beneath that contempt, he also saw something new: confusion. Where had he been for a month? How had he survived? Why did his eyes look like that? He ignored them all. His first stop was the abandoned storage room in the basement of the main academic building, a place he had discovered during his first year, when he had still believed that extra study hours might make a difference. It was small, dusty, and forgotten by everyone except the cleaning golems who passed through once a month. It was perfect. He closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall, finally allowing himself to breathe. The system window appeared again, unbidden, and new text scrolled across its surface. New skill unlocked. Monarch's perception allows user to perceive magical seals, enchantments, and hidden structures within a 100-meter radius. Passive ability, mana concealment. The user's true mana signature is automatically hidden from all detection methods below Monarch level. External monitoring will continue to show F-rank readings. Jae-Hyun focused on the passive ability, testing its limits. He could feel it now, a subtle distortion field around his body that bent perception, that made observers see what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. An F-rank student, barely worth noticing. A failure, soon to be expelled. Nothing to see here. It was the perfect camouflage. He raised his hand and concentrated, calling upon the mana that now flowed through him like a second bloodstream. A small flame appeared above his palm, not the weak, flickering candle flame that had been the limit of his power before, but a blazing orb of crimson fire that pulsed with contained fury. The heat was intense enough to make the air shimmer, but Jae-Hyun felt no discomfort. The fire was his. It obeyed him. He dismissed the flame and closed his eyes, thinking. The Directorate, Alara Vane, the seal on his birth. Who had done this to him? Why? And what else had they hidden from the world? The system provided no answers, only more questions, but it did provide something else, a path forward. Quest generated, uncover the truth. Objective, infiltrate the Academy Directorate and discover the purpose of the seal placed upon you. Reward, third seal release current, 1-3 seals broken. Warning, the Directorate contains individuals of significant power. Direct confrontation is not recommended at this stage. Recommended course of action, maintain F-rank appearance, gather information, build allies, strike when the time is right. Jae-Hyun read the quest description twice, then dismissed it with a grim smile. Maintain the F-rank appearance. Let them continue to underestimate him. Let them believe that he was still the same pathetic failure they had always known. And while they laughed at the weakest student in the academy, he would be learning their secrets, dismantling their plans, and growing strong enough to destroy them. He thought about the past 3 years, the cruelty, the isolation, the moment when his father had looked at him with cold eyes and said, "You are no son of mine." The moment when Professor Min had handed him the eviction notice. The moment when Alara Vane had smiled and told him to go die in hell mode. They had taken everything from him, his family, his future, his dignity. Now he would take everything from them. But first, he needed to survive. He pulled off his torn uniform jacket and examined his arms. The scars from hell mode were already fading, replaced by faint silver lines that seemed to pulse with their own light. The system called them Monarch's marks, physical evidence of the power he had absorbed in the dungeon. They would fade completely in time, he was told, but until then, he needed to keep them covered. He found a spare uniform in one of the storage room's forgotten lockers. Someone had left it behind years ago, and the cleaning golems had never bothered to remove it. It was slightly too large, but it would do. He changed quickly, making sure the marks were hidden beneath the fabric, and pinned his cracked F-rank insignia to his chest. He looked in a dusty mirror that hung on the wall. The reflection that stared back was familiar and strange all at once. The same face, the same build, but the eyes were different now. That crimson glow that he couldn't quite suppress, that marked him as something other than human. He concentrated, and the glow faded, replaced by the dull brown that everyone expected to see. But the power remained, always. He left the storage room as the morning bells began to ring, signaling the start of classes. Students streamed past him in the hallway, their conversations washing over him like water over stone. He heard whispers about the upcoming mana synchronization trials, about the legendary Crimson Princess who was expected to dominate the competition, about the mysterious portal that had appeared beneath the academy and then vanished a month later. No one mentioned Kang Jae-Hyun. No one noticed him at all. He was invisible, a ghost, and that he realized was the most dangerous thing he could be. He made his way to the administrative building, where the records of every student who had ever attended Ars Magna were stored. His eviction was still pending, which meant he still had access to the archives. It was a small window of opportunity, and he intended to use it. The archive was located on the 3rd floor, a cavernous room filled with towering shelves of bound records and enchanted crystals that stored information in ways that mere paper never could. Jae-Hyun had been here before, during his first year, when he had still believed that he might find some clue in the Academy's history that would explain his failure. Now, he was looking for something different. He walked past the student records, past the faculty dossier, past the history of the Academy's founder. His feet carried him to a section he had never noticed before, a section that, according to the system's Monarch's perception, was hidden behind a sophisticated illusion enchantment. He reached out and touched the shelf that seemed to be nothing but blank wall, and his fingers passed through the illusion like smoke. Behind it was a door, small, unremarkable, locked with a mechanism that hummed with ancient magic. Jae-Hyun pressed his palm against the lock and felt the seal react to his monarch's aura. The lock clicked open. He stepped through. The room beyond was small, barely larger than a closet, but it contained something that made Jae-Hyun's breath catch in his throat. A pedestal, carved from black stone, and on that pedestal, a book bound in what looked like human skin. He approached slowly, his senses alert for traps, but the room was silent still, as if it had been waiting for him for a very long time. The book's cover was blank, but when Jae-Hyun touched it, letters appeared, burned into the leather by an invisible hand. The true history of Ars Magna, by the first monarch, Asher the Unbroken. Jae-Hyun opened the book, and the world seemed to tilt around him. The words that flowed from the pages were not written in any language he knew, but he understood them perfectly, as if the meaning was being poured directly into his mind. And what he read made his blood run cold. Ars Magna had not been founded as a school. It had been built as a prison. The Hell Mode dungeon that Jae-Hyun had cleared was not a natural phenomenon. It was a seal, one of 7, created to contain a being of unimaginable power. A parasitic king that had nearly consumed the world 1,000 years ago, defeated only by the combined might of the 7 monarchs who had sacrificed themselves to bind it. But the binding had not been perfect. Over the centuries, the parasitic king had learned to reach out from its prison to influence the minds of those who guarded it. The Directorate, the Academy's secret ruling body, had been corrupted generations ago. They no longer sought to maintain the seal, they sought to break it. And they were using the students of Ars Magna to do it. The monosynchronization trials, the ranking system, the constant competition, the endless pressure to grow stronger, the way that the Academy's curriculum focused almost entirely on combat and power accumulation. It was all designed for one purpose: to cultivate vessels, to create bodies strong enough to host the parasitic king's fragments so that the seal could be weakened from within. The F-rank students, the ones like Jae-Hyun who seemed to have no potential, were not failures. They were the ones who had resisted the parasitic king's influence. The seal on his birth had not been placed to weaken him. It had been placed to protect him, to hide him from the Directorate's gaze, to keep him from being used as a vessel. But the protection had backfired. The seal had been too effective, locking away not just his mana but his potential, making him appear weak to the Directorate, yes, but also to everyone else, to his family, to his peers, to himself, until he had walked into Hell Mode and shattered it with his own hands. Jae-Hyun closed the book, his hands trembling. He understood now. The Directorate had not sent him into Hell Mode to die. They had sent him in because they had sensed the seal breaking, because they had realized that one of their hidden protectors had somehow survived, because they needed to eliminate the threat before it could fully awaken. But they had miscalculated. Jae-Hyun had not just shattered the seal in Hell Mode. He had absorbed the power of the parasitic king's prison, turning its own containment against it. He was no longer just a monarch. He was something new, something the Directorate had not planned for. He was the one who had cleared Hell Mode, and in doing so, he had become the only person in 1,000 years who understood the true nature of the enemy. He tucked the book into his jacket and left the hidden room, his mind already working through the implications. The monosynchronization trials were in 2 days. The Directorate would be watching, waiting for the right moment to begin their ritual. The students would be their sacrifices, and if Jae-Hyun did nothing, the parasitic king would break free, consuming everyone in its path. But if he acted too soon, the Directorate would kill him. He was strong now, yes, stronger than he had ever dreamed possible, but he was not strong enough to face all of them alone, not yet. He needed allies, he needed a plan, and he needed to do it all without letting anyone know that the weakest F-rank in the Academy had become something far more dangerous. He stepped out of the administrative building and into the sunlight, his face calm, his eyes dull brown, his insignia cracked and weak. The students who passed him saw nothing remarkable, just another failure waiting to be expelled. But beneath his jacket, the silver scars of a monarch glowed with hidden power, and in his chest, the heart of a man who had survived hell burned with a cold, terrible resolve. The game had begun, and Kang Jae-Hyun had no intention of losing. The monosynchronization trials were the most anticipated event of the academic year at Ars Magna Academy. For 3 days, the entire institution would grind to a halt as students were paired together in forced partnerships, their magical cores synchronized to face waves of summoned creatures in the grand arena. It was a test of compatibility, of teamwork, of the ability to merge one's power with another's to create something greater than the sum of its parts. For most students, it was a chance to prove themselves, to catch the eye of powerful professors, to climb the ranks and secure their futures. For the Directorate, Jae-Hyun now knew, it was something far darker, a harvest, a chance to identify the strongest vessels, to measure their compatibility with the parasitic king's fragments, to select the ones who would be consumed in the coming ritual. And for Kang Jae-Hyun, it was the first real test of his new reality. He stood at the edge of the training grounds as the sun rose over the arena's massive stone walls, watching the other students file into the waiting area. There were hundreds of them, clad in their combat uniforms, their insignias gleaming with the light of their respective ranks. B ranks, A ranks, and here and there, the rare S rank that made the crowd part like water around a stone. They laughed and talked and sized each other up, the tension of competition already crackling in the air like static before a storm. No one looked at Jae-Hyun. No one noticed the F rank insignia on his chest, the cracked emblem that marked him as the lowest of the low. He had become a master of invisibility over the past 3 years, and now, with the system's mono-concealment weaving its subtle illusion around him, he might as well have been a ghost. But he saw them, he saw everything. His eyes, still tinged with that faint crimson glow that he had learned to suppress but never fully hide, swept across the crowd with a predator's patience. He was looking for something specific, the telltale signs of Directorate influence that the book in his jacket had taught him to recognize. The slight discoloration in a student's aura, the unnatural stillness in their movements, the way their eyes sometimes glazed over, just for a moment, as if someone else was looking through them. He found 4 of them in the first minute, students who had been marked, who were already carrying fragments of the parasitic king within them. They didn't know it, of course. They probably thought the occasional blackouts and the strange whispers in their sleep were just stress, just the price of being the best. But Jae-Hyun knew better. They were walking time bombs, and when the Directorate gave the signal, they would become the first casualties of the coming war. The pairing assignments are posted. The announcement came from a floating crystal that hovered above the arena's entry, its surface shimmering with names and ranks, and the complex algorithms that determined which students would be forced together for the trials. Jae-Hyun pushed through the crowd, not aggressively, just with the patient persistence of someone who had long since learned that no one would make way for him, and found his name at the very bottom of the list. As always, but what he saw beside his name made him pause. Kang Jae-Hyun F. Partner, Seo Yoo-na S. A murmur rippled through the crowd as other students saw the pairing. Jae-Hyun heard the whisper, the sharp intakes of breath, the barely suppressed laughter. The F rank with the Crimson Princess. That's not a pairing, that's a sacrifice. She's going to kill him before the first wave even starts. Remember what she did to that B rank last year. They had to rebuild half the arena. I heard she petitioned the Directorate to have the pairing changed. They denied her request. Jae-Hyun's expression didn't change, but his mind was already working. The Directorate had arranged this. They had deliberately paired him with the strongest student in a year, the one whose volatile temper and legendary disdain for weakness made her the most likely to eliminate him before the trials even began. It was a test, or maybe an execution disguised as a test. Either way, they had miscalculated, because Seo Yoo-na, the Crimson Princess, the S-rank prodigy who had never lost a single match in her entire academic career, was exactly the kind of ally Jae-Hyun needed. He found her at the far end of the training grounds, standing apart from the other students like a volcano surrounded by fields of grass. Her uniform was immaculate, her crimson hair pulled back in a severe ponytail that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. Her insignia, an S-rank emblem that seemed to burn with its own inner fire, was pinned to her chest with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. She was beautiful in the way that a wildfire was beautiful, mesmerizing, terrifying. And right now, she was staring at Yi Hyun with an expression that could have melted steel. "You," she said, the single word carrying enough venom to kill a lesser man. Yi Hyun stopped a respectful distance away, far enough to show deference, close enough to show he wasn't afraid. "Seo Yoo-na, I'm your partner for the trials. I know who you are." Her eyes flicked to his insignia and her lip curled. "The eternal F-rank, the Academy's favorite joke. I've seen you in the training yards, you know, watching. Always watching like you're waiting for something. I thought you were just pathetic. Now I realize you're also lucky, because if I didn't need a partner to participate in the trials, I would incinerate you where you stand." The air around her shimmered with heat, and Yi Hyun felt the pressure of her mana pressing against his skin like a physical force. It was immense. He had felt power like this before, in hell mode, in the presence of creatures that had nearly killed him 100 times over. She was stronger than most of them, stronger than anything a student should be capable of. And yet, compared to what Yi Hyun carried within him now, she was a candle beside a star. He let none of that show on his face. Instead, he bowed his head, a gesture of submission that cost him nothing and would buy him everything. "I understand your frustration. I won't get in your way during the trials. Just let me stand in the corner and pretend to contribute. Your reputation won't suffer for being paired with someone like me. If anything, people will admire you more for carrying the dead weight." Yoo-na's eyes narrowed. "You think I care about what people think of me? I think you care about winning, and you can't win without a partner. The rules of the trials are clear. Both members of a pair must survive each wave or the team is disqualified. You need me alive, Seo Yoo-na, and I need to not be dead, so let's make a deal." He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly suppressed. She hadn't expected him to talk back. She hadn't expected him to know the rules better than she did. Most of all, she hadn't expected the F-rank to look at her with eyes that held no fear. "I'm listening," she said slowly. "During the trials, I stay out of your way. I don't touch anything, I don't say anything, I don't do anything that might embarrass you. In return, you make sure I survive. That's it. One day of pretending I don't exist, and then you never have to see me again." Yoo-na studied him for a long moment, her crimson eyes, so much like the color of his own hidden power, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she gave a sharp nod. "Fine, but if you so much as breathe wrong in my direction, I'll let the monsters have you. Understood?" "Perfectly." She turned away from him without another word, her cloak billowing behind her as she strode toward the arena entrance. Yi Hyun watched her go, his face calm, his heart steady. The trap was set. The first wave of the trials began an hour later. The arena, a massive circular structure that could hold 10,000 spectators, was filled to capacity. Nobles and mages from across the continent had gathered to watch the next generation of prodigies prove their worth, their boxes and balconies layered above the training grounds like tiers of a wedding cake. The students themselves stood on the arena floor, arranged in pairs, their weapons drawn and their mana already beginning to pulse in preparation for the coming battle. Yi Hyun stood at Yoo-na's side, careful to position himself just behind her shoulder, close enough to seem like a partner, far enough to be out of her way. He had drawn a training sword from the equipment rack, a simple blade with no enchantments, and he held it with the awkward grip of someone who had never been taught to use one properly. Or so he wanted everyone to believe. In truth, his grip was perfect, his stance was flawless, and his senses, honed to razor sharpness by a month in hell mode, were already mapping every inch of the arena, cataloging every threat, every weakness, every hidden trap that the Directorate had prepared for this day. Because they were here, he could feel them now, The Directorate members, watching from the highest balcony, their auras masked by illusions that his monarch's perception saw through like glass. Ilara Vane was among them, her violet eyes fixed on the arena floor with the hunger of a spider watching her web. And beside her, a figure that made Yi Hyun's blood run cold. The headmaster himself, a man who had seemed so benevolent, so grandfatherly, during the few times Yi Hyun had seen him address the student body. Now Yi Hyun saw the truth. The headmaster's body was a hollow shell, his eyes empty of anything but the parasitic king's hunger. He had been consumed long ago, his will subsumed by the very thing he had sworn to contain. And now he sat at the heart of the Directorate, pulling the strings of the academy like a puppeteer with his marionettes. The first wave will consist of 20 spectral wolves, the announcer's voice boomed across the arena, pulling Yi Hyun's attention back to the present. Each pair will face one wolf. Survive your encounter and you advance to the second wave. Fail and you will be removed from the trials, permanently. The last word hung in the air like a promise. Yi Hyun watched as the portals opened at the far end of the arena, each one disgorging a creature of shadow and teeth. The spectral wolves were massive, easily the size of horses, their bodies composed of swirling darkness that seemed to drink in the light around them. They were standard test subjects for the trials, creatures designed to challenge students without overwhelming them. But as Yi Hyun's eyes swept across the arena, he noticed something that made his stomach clench. The wolf that had been assigned to their section, the one that was even now stalking toward them with hunger in its hollow eyes, was not like the others. Its aura was wrong, its movements were wrong, and somewhere deep in its shadowy form, Yi Hyun could see the faint, pulsing glow of something that should not be there. A fragment. The parasitic king's influence had reached into the trials themselves. The wolf that approached them was not a test, it was an assassination. "Stay behind me," Yoo-na said, her voice tight with concentration. She raised her hands and flames erupted around her, a corona of crimson fire that made the air scream. "And try not to die." The wolf lunged. It was faster than it should have been, faster than any spectral wolf in the Academy's records. Its claws, extended into blades of shadow, slashed through the space where Yoo-na had been standing a moment before. She had dodged barely, her flames lashing out to meet the creature's advance. But the wolf twisted in midair, avoiding the worst of the blast, and landed on the arena floor with a grace that spoke of intelligence far beyond what the trials were supposed to allow. Yoo-na's eyes widened. She had fought spectral wolves before. She knew what they were capable of, and this one was something else entirely. "What?" she started, but the wolf was already moving again, a blur of shadow and fury that drove her back, step by step, her flames struggling to find purchase against its shifting form. Yi Hyun watched, his grip tightening on his training sword. He could see it now, the fragment pulsing in the wolf's chest, feeding it power, enhancing its speed and strength far beyond natural limits. The Directorate had sent this thing to kill him, to eliminate the variable that had survived hell mode before he could become a threat. They had underestimated Yoo-na, but even she couldn't hold out forever. The wolf was too fast, too strong, too relentless. Already he could see the strain in her movements, the way her flames were beginning to gutter as her mana reserves drained. In another minute, maybe two, she would be overwhelmed. And then the wolf would turn on him. Yi Hyun made a decision. He stepped forward, moving with a speed that no F-rank should possess. The training sword in his hand was a blur of motion as he intercepted the wolf's next attack, the blade meeting the creature's claws with a shower of sparks that lit up the arena like fireworks. Yoo-na stared at him, her mouth open. "What are you?" "Trust me," Yi Hyun said, and for a moment, just a moment, he let her see. Not all of it, just a glimpse of the power that burned behind his dull brown eyes. Just a flicker of the crimson light that marked him as something more than F-rank. She saw it, and whatever she saw made her pause, made her reassess everything she thought she knew about the weakest student in the academy. The wolf recovered from the block and lunged again, its jaws gaping wide, the fragment in its chest pulsing with malicious light. Yi Hyun moved, his body flowing through motions that he had learned in the depths of Hell Mode, motions that no training yard had ever taught him. He sidestepped the wolf's charge, pivoted on his heel, and brought the flat of his blade down on the creature's spine with a crack of displaced air. The wolf howled, a sound that was more rage than pain, and spun to face him. Its eyes, hollow pits of darkness, fixed on Jae-Hyun with a hatred that transcended the simple hunger of a summoned beast. It knew him. The fragment within it recognized the one who had shattered the seal, who had absorbed the power of Hell Mode, who was the greatest threat to the parasitic king's awakening. It lunged again, and this time Jae-Hyun did not dodge. He stepped into the attack, inside the wolf's reach, and drove his sword upward through the creature's chest, straight into the fragment that pulsed at its core. There was a moment of resistance, a scream of dying magic, and then the wolf dissolved into shadow, its fragment shattering into 1,000 pieces that scattered across the arena floor like broken glass. Silence. The entire arena had gone silent. 10,000 spectators, hundreds of students, the Directorate in their high balcony, all of them staring at the F-rank who had just killed a creature that an S-rank had been struggling to contain. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of the silence, his training sword raised, his chest heaving with exertion that was only half feigned. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, could see the shock on Yoo-na's face, could sense the sudden, sharp interest of the Directorate above. He had shown too much, he knew that, but he had had no choice. The wolf would have killed her, and without her, he would have no shield against the Directorate's scrutiny. He needed her alive. He needed her curious. He needed her on his side. He lowered his sword and turned to face her, letting his eyes fade back to their dull brown, letting his posture slump into the familiar awkwardness of the F-rank failure. "I got lucky," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby students to hear. The sword must have hit something vital. Yoo-na stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found something interesting, something valuable, something that she intended to keep for herself. "Lucky," she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Right." She stepped closer to him, close enough that no one else could hear what she said next. "I don't know what you are, Kang Jae-Hyun, but you're not an F-rank, and you're not lucky. You just saved my life and you're trying to pretend you didn't. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me the truth, all of it. And in return, I'm going to make sure that no one at this academy ever looks down on you again." Jae-Hyun met her eyes, seeing the hunger there, the need to understand what she had just witnessed. It was the same hunger that had driven her to become the Crimson Princess, the same drive that had made her the strongest student her year. And now, that hunger was focused entirely on him. He had planned for this, he had wanted this. But now that it was happening, he felt a flicker of something unexpected, guilt. She was not his enemy. She was just another student, another vessel, another potential sacrifice in a game she didn't even know she was playing. But guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when the fate of everyone in this arena depended on what he did next. "I'll tell you," he said quietly, "but not here, not now. After the trials, meet me in the old storage room beneath the main building. Come alone." Yoo-na's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "If this is a trick." "It's not a trick, it's a deal. You protected me during the trials like we agreed. Now I owe you the truth, that's all." She studied him for a moment longer, then turned away, her flames guttering out as she released her mana. The other students were still staring, still whispering, but Yoo-na's presence was enough to keep them at bay. No one wanted to be the one who asked the Crimson Princess why she was talking to an F-rank. The second wave was announced, and the trials continued. Jae-Hyun faded back into the background, letting Yoo-na take the lead, letting the other students forget that he had done anything remarkable. By the end of the day, the whispers had shifted from him to other things. A near accident in the third wave, a student who had collapsed from mana exhaustion, the unexpected appearance of a Directorate member on the arena floor. But Yoo-na did not forget, and when the trials ended, when the students dispersed to their dorms and the spectators returned to their carriages, she made her way through the empty hallways of the main building, down the stairs to the basement, to the old storage room where Kang Jae-Hyun was waiting. She found him sitting on a crate, his training sword balanced across his knees, his eyes, those strange, shifting eyes, fixed on the door as if he had been expecting her. "You came," he said. "You said you'd tell me the truth." She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, arms crossed, her S-rank insignia glowing faintly in the dim light. "So tell me, what are you?" Jae-Hyun set the sword aside and met her gaze. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he let the mask slip. The brown faded from his eyes, replaced by the full, burning crimson of a monarch's power. The F-rank insignia on his chest flickered, its cracks widening, revealing something dark and ancient beneath. And the air around him, the very atmosphere of the room, seemed to thicken with a pressure that made Yoo-na's breath catch in her throat. She had felt power before. She had stood in the presence of S-rank mages, of legendary warriors, of the headmaster himself. But this was different. This was not the power of a student or even a master. This was the power of something that had been forged in the depths of hell, tempered by suffering, and unleashed upon a world that had tried to bury it. "What I am," Jae-Hyun said, his voice carrying an echo that had not been there before, "is the one who cleared Hell Mode, the one who shattered the seal that was placed on me at birth, the one who is going to tear down the Directorate and everything they've built." He stood, and Yoo-na had to fight the urge to step back. "But I can't do it alone, so I'm going to offer you the same choice that was offered to me. Walk away, pretend you never saw this, and hope that the Directorate's plans don't consume you when they finally come to fruition. Or stand with me, fight with me, and help me save this academy from the darkness that's been growing in its heart for 1,000 years." He extended his hand. Yoo-na looked at it, then at his face, then at the eyes that burned with a fire that rivaled her own. She thought about the wolf, about the way he had moved, about the power she had glimpsed in that single moment of truth. She thought about the Directorate, about the strange whispers she had heard in the halls, about the students who had disappeared and never been spoken of again. She thought about what it meant to be the strongest, and she realized, for the first time in her life, that strength was not about standing alone at the top. It was about finding someone worth standing beside. She took his hand. "Tell me everything," she said, "and then tell me how we kill them." Jae-Hyun's smile, when it came, was the first genuine smile he had worn in 3 years. It was a beginning. The days that followed the mana synchronization trials passed in a blur of careful preparation and calculated deception. Jae-Hyun returned to his abandoned storage room each night, poring over the ancient book he had stolen from the Directorate's hidden archive, while Yoo-na maintained their cover by treating him with the same disdain she showed all the other lower-ranked students. To anyone watching, the Crimson Princess had already forgotten about her brief, inexplicable alliance with the F-rank failure. She ignored him in the hallway, scoffed at his presence in the training yards, and made a point of associating only with students whose ranks matched her own. It was a performance worthy of an award, and it worked perfectly. The Directorate's attention, Jae-Hyun noted with grim satisfaction, had shifted elsewhere. The trials had produced several promising vessels, students whose compatibility with the parasitic king's fragments was unusually high, and the Directorate was busy marking them, preparing them for the ritual that would take place during the upcoming Festival of Stars. Jae-Hyun's little display in the arena had been written off as luck, a fluke, the desperate last stand of a dying animal. No one was looking at him anymore. No one except the system. Hidden objective discovered. The first headmaster's testament. The Academy's founder left behind more than just a prison for the parasitic king. Deep within the Grand Library, a floor exists that has not been opened since the day Ars Magna was built. It can only be accessed by one who carries the blood of the monarchs, or one who has earned the right through the fires of Hell Mode. Warning, the hidden floor is not merely a location. It is a trial. The first headmaster's ghost awaits within, and he will not grant his knowledge freely. Those who enter but are found unworthy do not return. Jae-Hyun read the notification 3 times before dismissing it. He had learned in Hell Mode that the system never gave him anything he didn't need. If it was pointing him toward the grand library, toward this hidden floor, then that was where he needed to go. The question was how to get there without attracting attention. The Grand Library of Ars Magna was a marvel of magical architecture, a 7-story tower of white stone and enchanted glass that dominated the Academy's central square. It was said to contain more books than any other repository in the continent, its shelves stretching into spaces that were larger on the inside than appeared from without. Students spent their entire academic careers exploring its depths and still never saw more than a fraction of what it contained. But Jae-Hyun was not interested in the public floors. He needed to go deeper, much deeper. He waited until midnight, when the library's automated systems dimmed the lights and the few students who studied late returned to their dorms. Yoo-na was waiting for him at the base of the main staircase, her crimson hair hidden beneath a dark hood, her S-rank insignia replaced with a plain bronze pin that would not draw eyes. "You're sure about this?" she asked as he approached. Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but he could hear the tension beneath it. She had read his notes on the Directorate, on the parasitic king, on the true purpose of the Academy. She believed him, but believing and facing the unknown were two very different things. "I'm sure," Jae-Hyun said. "The system wouldn't have shown me the way if I wasn't ready." "The system," Yoo-na repeated, her lip curling slightly. She still didn't fully trust the invisible interface that only Jae-Hyun could see. "You realize how insane this sounds, right? A magical window that only you can perceive, telling you to break into the most secure section of the library to talk to a ghost. It's not the craziest thing that's happened to me this month." She couldn't argue with that. They moved through the library in silence, Jae-Hyun leading the way with his Monarch's perception active. The skill allowed him to see the security enchantments woven into the walls, the pressure plates hidden beneath the floor tiles, the sleeping wards that would trigger alarms if anyone crossed certain thresholds. He navigated around them all with the ease of someone who had spent a month dodging traps that would have killed lesser men 100 times over. The system guided him to a section of the library that he had never seen before, a circular reading room on the 6th floor that was supposedly reserved for faculty use. The shelves here were filled with books that radiated age and power, their bindings made of materials that Jae-Hyun couldn't identify, their titles written in languages that had been dead for millennia. But the system was not pointing him toward the books. Hidden floor entrance detected. Location, center of the reading room, 3 meters below the current floor level. Activation requirement, Monarch's blood. Jae-Hyun knelt in the center of the room, running his palm across the stone floor. To his mundane senses, it felt solid, unremarkable, but with Monarch's perception active, he could see the faint lines of an activation circle etched into the stone, their patterns so intricate that they had been invisible to the naked eye. "Stand back," he told Yoo-na. "I don't know what's going to happen when I activate this." She stepped back, her hands already beginning to glow with the first hints of flame. "If something goes wrong, I'm burning us a way out." Jae-Hyun drew a small knife from his belt, a simple blade, unenchanted, the kind of thing any student might carry for mundane tasks, and made a shallow cut across his palm. The blood that welled up was not the bright red of an ordinary human. It was darker, deeper, shot through with threads of silver and gold that seemed to move of their own accord. Monarch's blood. He pressed his palm to the center of the activation circle, and the world fell away. For a moment, Jae-Hyun felt as if he was falling through darkness, the same darkness that had swallowed him when he first entered Hell Mode. But this time, there was no pain, no sense of being torn apart and rebuilt. Instead, he felt himself being pulled downward, through layers of stone and magic, through barriers that had been designed to keep out everyone who did not carry the right to enter. And then abruptly, he was somewhere else. The hidden floor was not what he had expected. He stood in a chamber that seemed to exist outside of time and space, its walls made of a material that shimmered between solid stone and pure light. There were no shelves here, no books, no furniture of any kind. Just an empty, circular space, perhaps 50 meters across, with a ceiling that rose so high it disappeared into infinity. and in the center of that space, waiting for him, was a ghost. He had seen spirits before in hell mode. He had fought them, killed them, watched them dissolve into nothing. But this one was different. This one radiated a presence that made his monarch's blood sing in his veins, a power so ancient and so pure that it felt like standing in the presence of a living mountain. The ghost was old. That was the first thing Jae-Hyun noticed. Not old in the way of humans, with wrinkles and gray hair and the slow decay of age. Old in the way of stone, of mountains, of the earth itself. His face was sharp and angular, his eyes deep-set and piercing, his hair long and silver-white. He wore robes that had been fashionable 1,000 years ago, when the first mages were still learning to bend the world to their will. But it was his aura that made Jae-Hyun's breath catch in his throat. It was the aura of a monarch, the same power that burned in Jae-Hyun's own blood, the same ancient energy that had been sealed away for 1,000 years. This ghost had been one of the original 7, one of the heroes who had sacrificed themselves to bind the parasitic king. Kang Jae-Hyun, the ghost said, and his voice was like the grinding of tectonic plates, like the slow erosion of mountains. The first to clear hell mode in 1,000 years. The first to break the seal that was placed upon your blood. The first to stand in this chamber since I died trying to protect it. Jae-Hyun bowed, his body moving instinctively, responding to the weight of the presence before him. You are the first headmaster, Asher the Unbroken. I was. The ghost's eyes, pale as winter ice, fixed on Jae-Hyun with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Now I am something less. A memory given form, a guardian placed here to ensure that the secrets of the monarchs are not lost forever. He began to move, circling Jae-Hyun with a slow, deliberate pace, his ghostly feet leaving no marks on the shimmering floor. You have questions. I can see them burning in your eyes. You want to know why you were sealed. You want to know who placed the chains upon your blood. You want to know how to destroy the Directorate and free this academy from the shadow that has consumed it. Yes, Jae-Hyun said, not bothering to deny it. I want all of those things. Then you must earn them. The ghost stopped, turning to face him fully. The knowledge you seek is not something that can be given freely. It must be tested, forged, proved worthy of carrying. The monarchs did not gain their power by asking questions. They gained it by surviving impossible odds, by facing trials that would break lesser souls, by proving that they were strong enough to bear the weight of what they sought to protect. He raised his hand, and the chamber around them began to change. The walls of light shifted, darkened, became something solid and oppressive. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that pressed down on Jae-Hyun's shoulders like the weight of the ocean. And in the center of the chamber, where the ghost had been standing, a new figure began to take shape. It was a man, young, perhaps Jae-Hyun's age, with sharp features and dark hair and eyes that burned with the light of an S rank. He wore the uniform of an Ars Magna student, but it was an older style, one that had been out of fashion for decades. And on his chest, where Jae-Hyun's cracked F rank insignia sat, there was an emblem that glowed with the unmistakable light of pure, unadulterated power. Jin Sung-ho, the ghost said, and there was something in his voice now, something that might have been grief. The strongest student this academy has ever produced, an S rank so powerful that the Directorate feared what he might become. They marked him for the ritual as they mark all who show too much promise. But Jin Sung-ho was not content to be a vessel. He fought, he raged, and in the end they sacrificed him anyway, feeding his soul to the parasitic king to strengthen the seal that bound it. He looked at Jae-Hyun, and for a moment the ghost's ancient eyes held something almost human. You are not the first to walk this path, Kang Jae-Hyun. You are not the first to discover the truth and seek to fight it. Jin Sung-ho was the last of the monarch's heirs, the only other one who might have shattered the seal and claimed the power that now burns in your veins. But he was too young, too impatient, too proud, and when the Directorate came for him, he stood alone. The phantom of Jin Sung-ho opened its eyes, and Jae-Hyun felt the weight of its gaze like a physical blow. There was no consciousness there, no remnant of the man who had once been. Only purpose, only the echo of a warrior's final battle, preserved in this place, waiting for the next heir to prove themselves worthy. The trial is simple, the ghost said. Defeat Jin Sung-ho, not his body, not his power, but his will. The phantom you face is not a copy of his strength. It is a copy of his determination, his refusal to break, his desperate, furious need to survive. You cannot overpower it. You cannot outmaneuver it. You can only match it, soul to soul, and prove that you are worthy to carry the legacy that he could not. And if I lose? The ghost's smile was sad. Then you will join him in this place, a phantom yourself, waiting for the next heir who might succeed where you failed. Jae-Hyun looked at the phantom of Jin Sung-ho, at the power that radiated from its still form, at the eyes that burned with a fire that had been extinguished decades ago. He thought about what the ghost had said. Too young, too impatient, too proud. He thought about his own journey, the 3 years of humiliation, the month in hell mode, the cold, calculated fury that now burned in his chest instead of the hot, desperate rage that had driven him before. He was not Jin Sung-ho. He was not the strongest student the academy had ever produced. He was the weakest, the lowest, the one who had been forgotten and discarded and left to die in a dungeon that no one else had survived. And that, he realized, was why he would succeed where Jin Sung-ho had failed. "I accept," he said. The phantom moved. There was no warning, no signal, no moment of transition. One instant Jin Sung-ho was standing still, a statue of power frozen in the center of the chamber. The next, he was everywhere, his fists and feet and the blazing aura of his S-rank power filling Jae-Hyun's vision with death. Jae-Hyun barely had time to raise his arms before the first blow struck. It hit him like a mountain falling, like the weight of the ocean pressing down on his chest, and he felt his ribs crack, felt the air explode from his lungs, felt himself flying backward through the chamber with the force of a hurricane. He hit the floor and kept rolling, his body moving on instinct, the lessons of hell mode taking over where conscious thought had failed. The phantom's second blow struck the space where he had been a moment before, shattering the shimmering floor into a crater of fractured light. Jae-Hyun pushed himself to his feet, his blood already beginning to heal the damage, the Monarch's regeneration working faster than any ordinary healing spell. He could feel the system pulsing in the back of his mind, offering skills, offering power, offering the easy way out. But he refused it. The ghost had said this trial was not about power, it was about will. The phantom came at him again, and this time Jae-Hyun did not dodge. He stood his ground, his arms spread wide, his chest open, and he let Jin Sung-ho's attack hit him. The blow was devastating, a concentrated blast of pure mana that should have torn him apart. But Jae-Hyun did not break. He absorbed the impact, his body screaming in protest, his monarch's blood fighting to hold him together, and he looked into the phantom's burning eyes and saw what lay beneath. Fear. Jin Sung-ho had been afraid of the Directorate, afraid of what they would do to him, afraid of the power they wanted to force upon him. And that fear had driven him to fight alone, to trust no one, to die in a desperate, futile attempt to protect himself from a threat he could not face alone. The phantom hit him again, and Jae-Hyun let it. Each blow was a memory, a fragment of Jin Sung-ho's final moments, the terror and rage and desperate hope that had filled his soul as the Directorate closed in around him. Jae-Hyun felt those emotions as if they were his own, felt the loneliness of a man who had been too strong to trust anyone, too proud to ask for help, too afraid to let anyone close enough to see the weakness beneath the power. And in that moment, he understood. "You were alone," Jae-Hyun said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, even as the phantom's fists drove the breath from his lungs. "You had all that power, all that strength, and you still couldn't save yourself, because you didn't understand that strength isn't about standing alone." The phantom paused. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in its burning eyes, something that might have been recognition. "I was alone too," Jae-Hyun continued. "For 3 years I was the weakest, the lowest, the one that everyone forgot, and I hated it. I hated them. I wanted nothing more than to show them all, to prove that I was better, to stand above them and watch them crawl." He straightened, even as his body screamed in protest, even as his blood pooled on the floor beneath him. "But then I went into hell mode and I learned something. Being alone doesn't make you strong. It makes you desperate. It makes you fragile. It makes you the kind of person who gets killed by a phantom that doesn't even know it's already dead." He looked at Jin Sung-ho's phantom, at the echo of a man who had died fighting the same enemy that Yi Hyun now faced. And he saw, beneath the rage and the power and the desperate need to prove himself, the same thing that he had seen in his own reflection 1,000 times. A broken child, a victim of a system that had never cared about him, a soul that had been forged in fire and then discarded when it was no longer useful. "You don't have to fight anymore," Yi Hyun said softly. "I'll carry it from here. Your legacy, your power, your vengeance, I'll carry it all, and I won't carry it alone." He reached out, his hand trembling, his blood still flowing, and touched the phantom's face. The chamber exploded with light. When Yi Hyun opened his eyes again, he was lying on the floor of the hidden floor, his body aching, his blood still wet on the shimmering stone. But the phantom was gone, and in its place, floating in the air before him, was a single shard of crystal, pulsing with a light that was warm and gentle and somehow impossibly grateful. "Trust no one in the Directorate." The voice was Jin Sung-ho's, but it was softer now, freed from the rage and fear that had bound it for decades. The message echoed in Yi Hyun's mind, a warning and a gift, the last words of a man who had died trying to protect a world that had never protected him. Yi Hyun closed his hand around the crystal and felt its warmth spread through him, a new power settling into his bones, a new understanding taking root in his soul. The system pulsed in his mind, new notifications flooding his vision, but he dismissed them all. There would be time for that later. For now, he just lay there, breathing, feeling the ache in his body and the strange, quiet peace in his heart. The ghost of Asher the Unbroken stood over him, his ancient eyes unreadable. "You did not defeat him with power," he said. "You did not defeat him with strategy or skill. You defeated him with something far rarer. You offered him peace." Yi Hyun sat up slowly, his ribs still aching, his blood still flowing. He deserved that much. He deserved someone to remember that he wasn't just a weapon or a vessel or a cautionary tale. He was a person, and he died alone. The ghost was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled. It was not the smile of a king or a legend or an ancient guardian. It was the smile of an old man who had seen something good in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. "You are worthy," he said, "not because you are strong, but because you understand what strength is for." He raised his hand, and the hidden floor began to dissolve around them, the walls of light fading, the ceiling disappearing, the chamber shrinking until it was just the two of them, standing in a space that existed somewhere between memory and reality. "The answers you seek are in the book you already found," the ghost said. "But the power you need is not in any book. It is in the blood of the monarchs that flows through your veins, and in the bonds you are beginning to forge with those around you. The Directorate has ruled this academy for 1,000 years because they have made sure that no one ever stands together against them. They divide, they conquer, they consume." He placed a hand on Yi Hyun's shoulder, and for a moment the touch was warm, solid, real. "Do not make Jin Sung-ho's mistake. Do not try to carry this burden alone. You have allies now. Use them, trust them. Let them stand beside you when the darkness comes." "The Festival of Stars," Yi Hyun said. "That's when they're going to do it, isn't it? That's when they're going to awaken the parasitic king." The ghost nodded. "You have 3 weeks, use them wisely." He began to fade, his form dissolving into motes of light that rose toward the infinite ceiling. But before he disappeared completely, he spoke one last time, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of waiting. "The monarch's power is not just strength, Kang Jae-Hyun. It is the power to rule, and a ruler does not fight alone. A ruler inspires, a ruler unites. A ruler builds something that will outlast them, something that will protect the world long after they are gone." His eyes met Yi Hyun's one final time. "Be the ruler that Jin Sung-ho could not become. Be the one who breaks the cycle, who builds something new from the ashes of the old. Be the monarch that this world has been waiting for." And then he was gone. Yi Hyun stood alone in the hidden floor for a long moment, the crystal from Jin Sung-ho warm in his hand, the ghost's words echoing in his mind. Then slowly, he turned and walked toward the exit, toward the waiting world, toward the battle that was coming. Yoo-na was waiting for him in the reading room, her face pale with worry, her flames flickering uncertainly around her hands. When she saw him emerge from the activation circle, his clothes torn, his blood still wet on his skin, her eyes widened. "What happened?" she demanded. "You were gone for hours. I was about to." "I'm fine," Jae-Hyun said, and for the first time in a long time he meant it. He looked at her, at the fear and concern in her eyes, at the way her hands were still raised to protect him, and he felt something shift in his chest, something that might have been gratitude, something that might have been hope. "I'm fine," he said again, softer this time, "and I know what we need to do." He held up the crystal, watching it pulse with its gentle, grateful light. "We're going to save them, all of them. The students, the professors, everyone who's been used and discarded by the Directorate. We're going to tear down everything they've built, and we're going to build something better in its place." Yoo-na stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled. "That's a pretty big promise for someone who's still technically an F rank." Jae-Hyun laughed. It was a strange sound, rusty from disuse, but it was real. Not for much longer. He looked toward the window, toward the spires of Ars Magna rising against the night sky, toward the hidden chambers where the Directorate was even now preparing their ritual. 3 weeks until the Festival of Stars. 3 weeks until the parasitic king awakened. 3 weeks to build something that could stand against 1,000 years of corruption. He had been the weakest. He had been the lowest. He had been the one that everyone forgot. But now he was something else, something new, something that the Directorate had not planned for and could not control. He was the monarch who had walked through hell and returned with the power to change the world. And he was only getting started. The crystal that Jae-Hyun had taken from the hidden floor did not stop glowing for 3 days. It rested on the floor of his storage room, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat, casting strange shadows across the walls that seemed to move even when nothing was there to disturb them. Yoo-na had wanted to take it to her dorm, to have it examined by someone who understood magical artifacts, but Jae-Hyun had refused. This was not an artifact to be studied. It was a message, a legacy, a warning wrapped in light. And it was not finished with him yet. On the 3rd night after his return from the hidden floor, Jae-Hyun woke to find the crystal floating above his chest. Its light so bright that it illuminated every crack in the ceiling, every scratch on the walls, every shadow that lurked in the corners of the tiny room. He sat up slowly, his monarch's blood already reacting to the presence of something ancient and powerful, and watched as the crystal began to expand, to grow, to reshape itself into something new. The light coalesced into a figure, not the ghost of Asher the Unbroken, not the phantom he had faced in the trial, but something in between. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair that fell across his face and eyes that held the weight of a lifetime cut short. He wore the uniform of Ars Magna, but it was torn, burned, stained with blood that had dried decades ago. And on his chest, where his insignia should have been, there was only emptiness, a void. A reminder of what the Directorate had taken from him. Jin Sung-ho, not the phantom of rage and fear that Jae-Hyun had faced in the hidden floor. Something quieter, something that had been waiting, patient, for someone to finally hear what he had to say. "You're not supposed to be here," Jae-Hyun said, his voice low, careful not to wake the students in the rooms above. "The trial was over. I passed." "You passed the trial of the first headmaster." Jin Sung-ho's voice was soft, almost gentle, nothing like the roaring fury of the phantom. "But there is another trial, mine, the one I did not pass." He moved to the window, looking out at the spires of the academy with an expression that Jae-Hyun could not quite read. Longing, perhaps, or grief, or something even older, even deeper. "I was 17 when they came for me," Jin Sung-ho said, his voice distant, as if he was speaking to himself as much as to Jae-Hyun. "The strongest student in 100 years, an S-rank so powerful that the professors whispered about me in the faculty lounges, wondering what I would become. I thought I was invincible. I thought nothing could touch me." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I was a fool." He turned back to face Jae-Hyun, and for a moment, his eyes held the same burning intensity that the phantom had shown in the hidden floor. But there was something else there now, something that might have been wisdom, something that might have been regret. The Directorate approached me at the Festival of Stars. 3 years before I died, they came to me with an offer, power beyond anything I had ever imagined, a place at their table, a chance to be more than just a student, more than just a weapon. All I had to do was accept their mark. He touched his chest where his insignia should have been, and Jae-Hyun saw the shadow of something there. A brand, a scar that had never healed. I refused. I thought I was being noble. I thought I was standing up to evil, fighting for what was right. But I was just scared. Scared of what they would do to me. Scared of what I might become if I let them in. And my fear made me blind. He moved closer, and Jae-Hyun felt the weight of his presence like a physical force. Not power, something heavier, something that pressed against his soul and demanded to be heard. They did not need my consent. They never had. The mark was already there, placed on me when I first manifested my power, when the Academy's ranking system identified me as something special. The offer was just a formality, a courtesy, a way to make me think I had a choice when I never did. He raised his hand, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, deeper, more real. Jae-Hyun felt the temperature drop, felt the air grow thick with something that was not quite cold, not quite pressure, but something in between. They took me 3 years later, during the Festival of Stars, just as they will take the students who have been marked this year. I fought. Kings, I fought. I burned down half the academy trying to escape. I killed Directorate members, professors, anyone who got in my way, and in the end it didn't matter. There were too many of them, and I was alone. His voice cracked on the last word, and Jae-Hyun saw, for just a moment, the boy beneath the legend. The 17-year-old who had been so strong, so proud, so certain that he could face anything alone. The 17-year-old who had died screaming, his power consumed, his soul fed to a king that had been waiting 1,000 years for its next meal. I was alone, Jin Sung-ho whispered, and that is why I failed. He looked at Jae-Hyun, and his eyes were clear now, free of the rage and the fear and the desperate need to prove himself. You have something I did not. You have allies, people who believe in you, people who will stand beside you when the darkness comes. That is why you will succeed where I failed. That is why the first headmaster chose you, why the system chose you, why the monarch's blood chose you. He reached out, and his hand passed through Jae-Hyun's chest. Not cold, not warm, but something in between. Something that felt like memory, like legacy, like the weight of 1,000 years of waiting finally being lifted. I cannot help you fight. I am only a shadow, a whisper, a memory of a boy who was too proud to ask for help. But I can give you something. Something that the Directorate could never take from me, no matter how much they tried. Jae-Hyun felt something shift inside him. Not power, not strength, but something deeper. Something that settled into the core of his being and began to grow. My will, Jin Sung-ho said, and his voice was strong now, certain, the voice of a man who had faced death and refused to break. The Directorate consumed my power. They fed my soul to their king, but they could not break my will. They could not make me submit. And that will, that stubborn, foolish, impossible will, is the one thing that can still hurt them. The shadows in the room began to recede, the light returning, the warmth coming back. Jin Sung-ho's form was fading, his edges blurring, his voice growing distant. When the Festival of Stars begins, they will try to break you. They will show you your fears, your weaknesses, your failures. They will try to make you doubt, to make you despair, to make you believe that you are alone. Do not let them. Remember me. Remember the boy who was too proud to ask for help, who thought he could face the darkness alone, who died because he did not understand that strength is not about standing alone. He smiled, and for a moment, he was just a boy again. Just a 17-year-old who had been given too much power and not enough wisdom, who had tried to be a hero and failed, who had died with nothing but his will to keep him whole. You are not alone, Kang Jae-Hyun. Never forget that. And then he was gone. The crystal fell to the floor with a soft clink, its light faded, its pulse stilled. It was just a crystal now, a pretty bauble, a souvenir from a place that no longer existed. But Jae-Hyun could still feel Jin Sung-ho's presence in his chest, still hear his voice in his mind, still carry the weight of his legacy in his blood. He sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about what he had been told. 3 years. That was how long Jin Sung-ho had known about the Directorate, how long he had waited, how long he had been too proud to ask for help. 3 years of watching, of waiting, of hoping that he could somehow save himself. 3 years that had ended in fire and blood, and the death of a boy who had never had a chance. Yi Hyun thought about his own 3 years, the humiliation, the isolation, the slow, grinding erosion of everything he had once believed about himself. He had been alone too. He had been too weak to matter, too worthless to notice, too forgot to be worth saving. But that was before Hell Mode, before the system, before Yoo-na, before the ghost and the crystal and the shadow of a boy who had died trying to do the same thing that Yi Hyun was trying to do now. He was not Jin Sung-ho. He was not the strongest, the brightest, the most promising student the Academy had ever produced. He was the weakest, the lowest, the one that everyone had forgotten, and that he realized was his greatest strength. The Directorate was watching for heroes. They were watching for prodigies, for legends, for the ones who shone so bright that they could not be ignored. They had consumed Jin Sung-ho because he was too bright to hide, too powerful to overlook, too promising to let live. But Yi Hyun was none of those things. To the Directorate, he was nothing, a ghost, a failure, a student who had already been written off, already been forgotten, already been discarded. He was invisible, and an invisible enemy was the most dangerous kind. He picked up the crystal, feeling its warmth in his palm, feeling the echo of Jin Sung-ho's will still pulsing within it. He would carry that will with him. He would carry the memory of the boy who had died alone, the boy who had been too proud to ask for help, the boy who had learned too late that strength was not about standing alone. He would carry it, and he would not make the same mistakes. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Yi Hyun threw himself into his training with a focus that bordered on obsession. He woke before dawn each morning, before even the earliest students stirred, and slipped out of the academy grounds to the cliffs that overlooked the sea. There, hidden from the wards and the watchers and the ever-present eyes of the Directorate, he practiced. The system had given him skills, dozens of them, each one more powerful than anything he had ever dreamed of possessing. But power without control was useless. He had learned that in Hell Mode, where a single misstep meant death. He had learned it again in the hidden floor, where raw strength had meant nothing against Jin Sung-ho's will. So he practiced until his muscles burned and his mana reserves ran dry, and the system began to flash warnings about overexertion. He practiced until the cliffs were scarred with the marks of his power, until the sea itself seemed to recoil from the force of his blows, until the very air around him crackled with the energy of a monarch coming into his own. Skill unlocked. Monarch's domain 5%. Skill unlocked. Shadow step mastered. Skill unlocked. Seal release level 2. Warning, mana reserves critical. Recommended rest period 12 hours. He ignored the warnings. There was no time for rest. 3 weeks. That was all the time he had before the Festival of Stars, before the Directorate's ritual, before the parasitic king awakened and consumed everyone he was trying to protect. But even as he pushed himself harder, faster, further, he did not make Jin Sung-ho's mistake. He did not push Yoo-na away. Every evening, after the training yards had emptied and the professors had retired to their quarters, she came to his storage room. She brought food sometimes, or books from the library that she thought might help, or just her presence, her steady, unwavering belief that he was doing something that mattered. They planned together. They talked through strategies, contingencies, backup plans for their backup plans. Yi Hyun shared everything he had learned from the hidden floor, from the ghost, from Jin Sung-ho's crystal, and Yoo-na, in turn, shared what she had learned from her years at the academy, the secrets she had uncovered, the weaknesses she had observed in the Directorate's operations. "They have a blind spot," she said one evening, tracing a map of the academy grounds that she had spread across the floor. "The old catacombs. They were sealed off 50 years ago after some kind of accident, and no one's been down there since. But the records show that they connect to every major building on campus. including the Grand Hall where the Festival of Stars is held. Jae-Hyun studied the map, his monarch's perception already picking out the faint traces of old wards, old barriers, old secrets that had been buried and forgotten. Can we use them, move troops through them without being detected? Yoo-na shook her head. The entrances are all sealed with Directorate-level wards. Even I couldn't break through them without setting off every alarm in the academy. She looked up at him, a gleam in her eye. But maybe you could. Jae-Hyun considered the map, the wards, the possibilities. The system was already calculating, analyzing, offering solutions. He could feel the power in his blood responding to the challenge, the monarch's authority pressing against the barriers that had been placed to keep people out. I can, he said slowly, but it will take time. I'll need to go down there, map the catacombs, find a way to disable the wards without triggering them. One wrong move and the Directorate will know something's happening. Then we make sure they're looking somewhere else when you do it. Yoo-na's smile was sharp, predatory. The Crimson Princess making a scene, causing trouble. That's not exactly out of character. Jae-Hyun looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the way she was already planning her part in this, already committing herself to a fight that was not hers. You know this isn't your battle. You could walk away. No one would blame you. Her expression hardened. Those students they're planning to sacrifice, I know some of them, I train with them, I compete against them. They're arrogant and annoying and they think they're better than everyone else. She paused and something in her face softened. But they don't deserve what's coming. No one does. She met his eyes, and for a moment, she was not the Crimson Princess, the S-rank prodigy, the untouchable queen of the academy. She was just a girl who had been given power she didn't ask for, who had spent her life being told she was special, who was only now beginning to understand what that really meant. My whole life, people have told me that I'm meant for something great, that I'm going to change the world, become someone important, do things that no one else can do. She laughed, a sound that was half bitter, half amused. I always thought they meant I was going to be powerful, that I was going to stand at the top, look down at everyone else, and know that I had won. She looked at Jae-Hyun, at the cracked F-rank insignia on his chest, at the eyes that held secrets she was only beginning to understand. But that's not what greatness is it? It's not about standing at the top. It's about standing in the right place when it matters most. Jae-Hyun was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached out and took her hand. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in me, for standing with me, for being here when I needed someone to be here." Yoo-na's cheeks flushed just slightly and she looked away. "Don't get sentimental, we have work to do." But she didn't pull her hand away. The first sign that something had gone wrong came on a Tuesday. Jae-Hyun had been in the catacombs for 3 nights, mapping the ancient tunnels that twisted beneath the academy like the roots of some vast, dead tree. The system's monarch's perception had proven invaluable, allowing him to see through the old wards that sealed the entrances, to navigate the labyrinthine passages that had been forgotten by everyone except the rats and the shatters. He had found 3 routes to the Grand Hall, 2 to the Directorate's inner chambers, and 1, a narrow shaft that descended deeper than any of the maps showed, that led towards something that pulsed with a power so ancient it made his monarch's blood sing. He had been about to explore that shaft when the warning came. Alert, external monitoring, anomaly detected. The seal remnants that mask your true power have been probed. Source: unauthorized magical scan originating from the Directorate's central spire. Recommendation: immediate cessation of all activities that may attract attention. The scan was not successful in penetrating the concealment, but it has registered the existence of an anomaly within the Academy's student body. Jae-Hyun had frozen in the darkness of the tunnel, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Directorate was looking for something. They had sensed something wrong, something that didn't fit with their carefully controlled narrative of the Academy's operation. They didn't know what it was. The system was clear about that, but they knew something was there. And they would not stop searching until they found it. He had pulled back from the catacombs, had returned to his storage room with the dawn, had spent the day in a state of heightened awareness that left him exhausted and irritable. Na had noticed, had asked him what was wrong, had listened in silence as he explained the situation. Her face had grown pale, but her jaw had set in that stubborn line that he had come to recognize. "Then we move faster," she had said. "We don't have time to be careful anymore." But careful was all they could afford to be, because the second sign that something had gone wrong came the very next day, and it came in the form of Professor Ilara Vane. Jae-Hyun was leaving the dining hall when he saw her. She was standing at the end of the corridor, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, her violet eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She was not looking at him the way the other professors looked at him, with dismissal, with contempt, with the casual cruelty of those who had already decided he was worthless. She was looking at him the way a hawk looks at a mouse it has spotted in the grass. And she was smiling. "Kang Jae-Hyun," she called, her voice carrying across the corridor with a warmth that was entirely false. "A moment, if you please." The other students in the corridor, there were always other students, always witnesses, always people who would remember what they had seen, stopped to watch. Jae-Hyun saw the curiosity in their eyes, the speculation, the barely concealed hope that the F-rank was about to be publicly humiliated. He had given them so many shows over the past 3 years. They were hungry for another. He stopped, turned bold. "Professor Vane." She approached him with the grace of a cat, her robes swirling around her feet, her smile never wavering. Up close, she was even more unsettling. There was something wrong with her aura, something that Jae-Hyun's monarch senses could perceive even when his eyes could not. A distortion, a flicker, as if the woman standing before him was not entirely real. "I've been meaning to speak with you for some time," she said, her voice low, conspiratorial. "You've been quite the subject of conversation lately, the F-rank who survived the trials, the weakest student who somehow managed to kill a spectral wolf that had an S-rank struggling." She tilted her head, and her eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement or hunger or both. "People are starting to wonder about you, Kang Jae-Hyun, and I do so hate it when people wonder about things without me." Jae-Hyun kept his face carefully neutral, his posture submissive, his eyes downcast. He was the F-rank. He was the failure. He was the boy who had been humiliated so many times that he had forgotten how to be anything else. That was the mask he had worn for 3 years, and he wore it now with the same desperate hope that had always accompanied it. The hope that if he was small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, the predators would look elsewhere. But Ilara Vane was not looking elsewhere. She was looking directly at him, and her gaze was sharp enough to cut through stone. "I've reviewed your file," she continued, circling him slowly, her heels clicking against the stone floor. "F-rank on entry, F-rank after first semester, F-rank after second. 3 years of being the lowest performing student in the history of this academy. No improvement, no progress, no indication that you possessed any magical talent whatsoever." She stopped in front of him, her face inches from his own. "And then, suddenly, you kill a spectral wolf that was enhanced far beyond the parameters of the trials. A wolf that, according to our records, should have been impossible for any student below A rank to defeat." Her smile widened. "Would you like to explain that, Kang Jae-Hyun?" Jae-Hyun's mind raced. He had known this moment would come. He had prepared for it, planned for it, rehearsed the lies he would tell when the Directorate finally came to question him. But now that it was here, with Ilara's eyes boring into his and the weight of her power pressing against his skin, he found that all his careful preparations meant nothing. The system was silent. It could not help him here. This was not a fight he could win with power or skill or the ancient abilities of a monarch. This was a test of something far more fragile, his ability to lie to someone who had spent a century perfecting the art of seeing through lies. "I got lucky," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The sword hit something vital. I don't know what. I was just trying to protect myself." "Lucky?" Ilara's voice was flat. "You expect me to believe that an F-rank, a student with no measurable magical ability, got lucky against a creature that had been enhanced by Directorate-level magic?" Jae-Hyun's blood ran cold. She had just admitted openly that the wolf had been tampered with, that the Directorate had deliberately sent a creature beyond the trial's parameters into the arena. She was not even trying to hide it. She was testing him, watching to see how he would react, waiting for him to slip. He did not slip. He had spent 3 years learning to keep his face still, his voice steady, his emotions buried so deep that even he could not find them. "I don't know anything about Directorate magic," he said. "I'm just an F rank. I've always been an F rank. Whatever happened in the arena, it wasn't because of anything I did." Alara studied him for a long moment, her violet eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, she laughed. It was a beautiful sound, like wind chimes in a storm, and it made Jae-Hyun's skin crawl. "Oh, I like you," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been admiration or might have been the anticipation of a cat who had just realized its prey was more interesting than it had expected. "I like you very much." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers cold against his cheek. Jae-Hyun forced himself not to flinch, not to pull away, not to give her any indication that her touch made him want to burn the world down. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I've been doing this for a very long time, longer than you've been alive, certainly, and in all that time I've learned to recognize something, a certain quality in certain people." Her fingers traced down his jawline, came to rest under his chin. "The quality of someone who is hiding something, something important, something that they would die to protect." She tilted his head up, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You have that quality, Kang Jae-Hyun. I saw it the first time I looked at you, 3 years ago when you walked through these gates with hope in your heart and failure in your blood. I saw it when you stood in the courtyard, watching your world crumble around you, and you didn't shed a single tear. I saw it in the arena, when you moved faster than any F rank should be able to move, when you killed something that should have killed you." Her smile faded, and for a moment, just a moment, Jae-Hyun saw something behind her eyes. Something cold, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a very long time to find what it was looking for. "You cannot hide from me, Kang Jae-Hyun. I have been searching for someone like you for 1,000 years, and now that I have found you, I will not let you go." She released him, stepped back, and her smile returned, bright and warm and utterly terrifying. "I will be watching you, closely, and when you finally slip, and you will slip, they always do, I will be there, ready to learn all your little secrets." She turned and walked away, her robe swirling behind her, her heels clicking against the stone. The other students in the corridor parted before her like water before a stone, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They had heard every word. They had seen every gesture, and they were all, Jae-Hyun knew, already spreading the story to everyone they knew. The F rank had caught the Directorate's attention, and in the world of Ars Magna, that was a death sentence. Jae-Hyun stood in the corridor for a long time after she had gone, his heart pounding, his blood burning, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios, 1,000 plans, 1,000 ways to survive what was coming. But no matter how many paths he traced, how many contingencies he prepared, how many backup plans he created, they all led to the same conclusion. He was out of time. The Festival of Stars dawned bright and golden over Ars Magna Academy, a morning so beautiful it felt like a lie. Jae-Hyun stood at the edge of the Grand Hall, hidden in the shadow of a marble column, watching the nobility of the continent file through the massive oak doors like peacocks preening for a crowd. They wore silks and velvets and jewels that glittered in the morning light, their laughter ringing across the courtyard like bells. They had come from every corner of the known world, dukes from the northern provinces, merchant princes from the eastern trade cities, archmages from the western enclaves, all gathered to witness the greatest event of the academic year. Not one of them knew they were walking into a slaughterhouse. Yoo-na stood beside him, her crimson hair hidden beneath a hood, her S-rank insignia replaced with the plain bronze pin of a second-year student. Her face was pale beneath the shadow of the hood, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had spent the night going over the plan with him, memorizing every detail, every contingency, every possible way that today could go wrong. She knew what was coming. She knew what they were about to face. But knowing and seeing were two different things. "There are so many of them," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. We can't protect them all." "We don't have to protect them all." Jae-Hyun's voice was calm, steadier than he felt. We just have to break the ritual before it completes. The Directorate needs the festival to gather enough mana for the awakening. If we can disrupt the flow, if we can destroy the focal points, the parasitic king won't be able to manifest fully. He looked at the Grand Hall, at the massive structure of white stone and enchanted glass that dominated the Academy's central square. It had been built 1,000 years ago, in the aftermath of the first monarch's sacrifice, and every stone of it was woven with magic. The system had shown him the truth last night, when he had finally had time to process what they had found beneath the catacomb. The Grand Hall was not just a building, it was a conduit. A channel designed to gather the mana of everyone who entered it and direct it toward the seal beneath the Academy. The Festival of Stars had never been a celebration. It had always been a harvest. The ritual circles, Yoo-na said, her eyes scanning the crowd. You said there were 12 of them, spread throughout the Academy grounds. 13, Jae-Hyun corrected. The system found another one last night, hidden beneath the main stage. He pointed toward the center of the courtyard, where a massive platform had been erected for the opening ceremonies. That's the primary focal point. If we can destroy that one, the rest will collapse. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small crystal, not the one Jin Sung-ho had left him, but something smaller, something he had spent the past week creating in secret. It pulsed with a dark light, a light that drank in the morning sun instead of reflecting it. Yoo-na looked at it, and her eyes widened. What is that? A bomb. Jae-Hyun's voice was flat. The first monarch taught me how to make it. He said it was the only thing that could destroy the focal point without triggering the seal's failsafes. He didn't tell her what else the first monarch had said. He didn't tell her about the cost of using the crystal, about the power it would drain from him, about the fact that he would be vulnerable, more vulnerable than he had been since Hell Mode, for hours after it was used. He didn't tell her that if they failed today, if the crystal didn't work, if the Directorate overwhelmed them before he could recover, there would be no second chances. She didn't need to know. She had enough to carry already. When do we move? She asked. Jae-Hyun looked at the sun, at the shadows creeping across the courtyard, at the nobles streaming into the Grand Hall like sheep being led to slaughter. The opening ceremonies would begin at noon. The ritual would begin an hour after that. The parasitic king would awaken at dusk. We move at the third bell, he said. During the combat exhibition, that's when the Directorate's attention will be focused on the arena, when the students are showing off their power, when the nobles are distracted by the spectacle. He reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his, the slight tremor that ran through her fingers. She was afraid. He was afraid too, but fear was not the enemy. Fear was what kept you alive. Fear was what made you fight. When the crystal goes off, the ritual will break, the seal will stabilize, and the Directorate will know that we're here. He looked into her eyes, seeing the fire that burned there, the same fire that had made her the Crimson Princess, the same fire that had brought her to his side when everyone else had abandoned him. That's when the real fight begins. She squeezed his hand, and her grip was strong, steady. I know. Yoo-na, he paused, searching for the words. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. Her voice was fierce, almost angry. You didn't survive Hell Mode just to die here. You didn't break the seal and become a monarch just to let the Directorate win. You're going to place that crystal, you're going to destroy the focal point, and then we're going to burn every last one of them to ash. She released his hand and stepped back, pulling her hood lower over her face. I'll be in the east wing when the third bell rings. Don't be late. She turned and disappeared into the crowd before he could respond, her crimson hair vanishing beneath the sea of silks and velvets like a spark swallowed by shadow. Jae-Hyun watched her go, and for a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than the cold, calculating focus that had carried him through Hell Mode and the catacombs and the nightmare of the past week. He allowed himself to hope. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Jae-Hyun moved through the academy like a ghost, his mana concealment wrapped around him like a shroud, his monarch's perception scanning every corner of the grounds for the ritual circles he had discovered. He found them all, the one beneath the fountain in the central square, the one hidden in the old chapel, the one carved into the floor of the library's main reading room. 12 circles, each one pulsing with a dark light that only he could see, each one feeding power into the 13th beneath the main stage. He could have destroyed them then. He had the power now to shatter them with a thought, to break the ritual before it could even begin. But the first monarch had warned him against it. The circles were linked. Destroy one and the others would sense it. The Directorate would know. The ritual would begin early, and the students, the nobles, everyone who had gathered for the festival would be caught in the crossfire. No, he had to wait. He had to strike all 13 at once, in the moment when the ritual was at its peak, when the Directorate was most vulnerable. It was the only way. He returned to the Grand Hall as the second bell rang, taking his place among the students who had been assigned to the combat exhibition. His F-rank insignia drew stares, as always, but he paid them no attention. He was beyond caring what they thought. He was beyond caring about anything except the mission. The Grand Hall was magnificent. Jae-Hyun had seen it before, during his first year, when he had still believed that he might one day stand on its stage and be celebrated for something he had accomplished. It was vast, larger than any building had a right to be, its ceiling disappearing into a dome of enchanted glass that showed the sky in all its glory. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting the history of the Academy, the founding, the great mages, the victories and triumphs that had made Ars Magna the greatest institution of magic in the world. None of the tapestries showed the truth. None of them showed the first monarch's sacrifice, or the parasitic king, or the 1,000 years of corruption that had festered beneath the Academy's shining surface. They showed only what the Directorate wanted the world to see: power, glory, the endless march of progress toward a future that had been stolen before it was ever born. Jae-Hyun found a seat near the back of the student section, where the F-ranks and D-ranks and other failures were herded like cattle. The students around him were nervous, excited, their eyes fixed on the stage where the headmaster would soon appear. They talked about the combat exhibition, about the ranking, about who would be promoted and who would be held back. They talked about their futures, their careers, the lives they would build after they left the Academy. They had no idea that they might not live to see tomorrow. The third bell rang. Jae-Hyun's heart lurched. He stood, his hands trembling, his blood burning, his monarch's power pressing against the seal of his F-rank, disguised like a caged animal desperate to be free. He had to move now. He had to get to the stage, to place the crystal, to destroy the focal point before the ritual could begin. But before he could take a single step, the lights went out. Not the ordinary darkness of a room without light. This was something else, something that swallowed the sun, that drank the flames of the torches, that smothered the glow of the enchanted crystals that lined the walls. The Grand Hall plunged into a darkness so complete, so absolute, that Jae-Hyun could not see his own hand in front of his face. And then the screaming started. He heard it first from the nobles section, the high, shrill screams of women who had never known fear, who had never faced anything more dangerous than a political rival. Then from the student section, where the younger students were crying out for parents who were not there. And then, from everywhere at once, the sound of something that was not quite human, something that moved through the darkness like a shark through water, something that was hungry. Jae-Hyun's monarch's perception blazed to life, cutting through the darkness like a blade. He saw them now, the Directorate mages standing at the edges of the hall, their hands raised, their spells already woven. They had started the ritual early. They had known. They had always known. And in the center of the hall, standing on the main stage where the headmaster should have been, was Alara Vane. She was not pretending anymore. Her human form had fallen away like a discarded mask, and what stood in its place was something that made Jae-Hyun's blood run cold. She was tall, taller than any human had a right to be, her limbs too long, her fingers too many, her face a shifting mask of features that could not quite settle into any recognizable shape. Her hair floated around her like a living thing, silver strands that moved with a purpose, that reached out toward the screaming nobles like the tendrils of some deep-sea creature. And her eyes were the worst. They were no longer violet, they were black, Black as the void between stars, black as the darkness that had swallowed the hall, black as the hunger that had been waiting 1,000 years to be fed. "Welcome," she said, and her voice was not one voice but many, a chorus of whispers that came from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome to the festival of stars. Welcome to the harvest. Welcome to the end of everything you have ever known." She raised her hand, and the darkness moved. Tendrils of shadow reached out from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, wrapping around the nobles, the students, the professors who had not been part of the Directorate. They struggled, they screamed, they fought, but the shadows were stronger than anything they had ever faced. The shadows were the hunger of a king that had been waiting 1,000 years for its feast. Jae-Hyun moved. He could not wait for the plan. He could not wait for the signal. He could not wait for Yoo-na to be in position, for the crystal to be placed, for the perfect moment that they had spent 2 weeks preparing for. The moment was now, and if he did not act, everyone in this hall would die. He vaulted over the rows of seats, his monarch's power flaring, his F-rank disguise burning away like paper in a fire. The students around him stared, their eyes wide, their mouths open, as the weakest student in the academy transformed into something that none of them could explain. The darkness tried to hold him, tried to wrap around his limbs, tried to pull him down into the hunger. But his monarch's blood burned too bright. The shadows could not touch him. He reached the stage as Alara's head turned, her black eyes fixing on him with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been delight. "You," she said, and the chorus of whispers rose to a crescendo. "I knew you would come. I knew you would not be able to resist. The hero always comes. The hero always tries to save everyone, and the hero always fails." She raised her hand, and the shadows converged on Jae-Hyun from every direction. He dodged, ducked, weaved, his movements a blur of speed that should have been impossible for any human. But there were too many. The shadows were everywhere, and they were not just shadows. They were the will of a king that had been practicing for 1,000 years. A tendril caught his ankle and he fell. Another wrapped around his wrist, pinning his arm to the stage. Another around his throat, squeezing, choking, cutting off his air. He struggled, he fought, he burned, but the shadows were stronger. The shadows were the hunger of something that had consumed worlds before this one, that had devoured civilizations, that had broken kings and heroes and everything that had ever stood in its way. Alara knelt beside him, her shifting face inches from his own. "You are strong," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that might have been admiration. "Stronger than Jin Sung-ho, stronger than any of them, but strength is not enough. It was never enough. The first monarch was stronger than, the 7 were stronger than all of us, and still they fell, still they failed, still they could not stop what was coming." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers cold as ice, her touch sending a wave of darkness through his mind, his soul, his very being. "You will be the vessel, you will host the king, and you will be perfect, more perfect than any of them, because you have something they did not. You have hope. And hope, when it is broken, when it is consumed, when it is twisted into something that feeds the hunger." She smiled, and her smile was the smile of something that had been waiting for this moment since before the stars were born. Hope is the sweetest thing of all. Jae-Hyun felt the darkness closing in, felt the hunger reaching for him, felt the parasitic king stirring in its prison, reaching out to claim the vessel that had been prepared for it. He thought of Yoo-na, of her fire, of the promise she had made to burn the Directorate to ash. He thought of Jin Sung-ho, of his will, of the legacy that he had passed on to the one who would finish what he had started. He thought of the first monarch, chained in the darkness beneath the academy, waiting for someone to free him, to finish what he had begun. And he thought of himself, Kang Jae-Hyun, the F-rank, the failure, the boy who had walked into hell mode because he had nothing left to lose, who had walked out with the power of a monarch in his blood, who had spent 3 years being nothing so that he could become something that no one had ever expected. He reached into his jacket, his fingers closing around the crystal. The darkness tried to stop him, tried to hold his arm, tried to keep him from what he was about to do. But his monarch's blood was burning now, burning brighter than it ever had before, burning with the fire of 1,000 years of waiting, of hopping, of believing that someone someday would be strong enough to break the cycle. He threw the crystal. It arced through the darkness, trailing a light that was not light, a shadow that was not shadow, a contradiction that made the hungry king pause, just for a moment, just long enough to wonder what it was seeing. And then it struck the center of the stage, where the 13th ritual circle pulsed with the power of 1,000 years of preparation. The explosion was not loud, it was not bright, it was something else, something that existed in a space between sound and silence, between light and dark, between what was and what should never have been. The crystal shattered, and the ritual circle shattered with it, and the darkness that had filled the grand hall began to scream. Alara screamed too, a sound that was not human, not even close to human, a sound that tore through the hall like a physical force. Her form began to shift, to warp, to collapse, the shadows that made up her body falling apart like a sand castle in a storm. She reached for Jae-Hyun, her fingers stretching, reaching for the vessel that was slipping away from her. But it was too late. The ritual was broken. The seal was stabilizing. The parasitic king was being pushed back, pushed down, pushed into the darkness where it had been imprisoned 1,000 years ago. And Kang Jae-Hyun, the weakest student in the academy, the F-rank who had walked into hell mode and walked out of Monarch, stood in the center of the grand hall and watched it fall. The grand hall had become a battlefield. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of the chaos, Yoo-na's flames crackling around them like a protective cocoon, his own monarch's blood slowly beginning to stir again after the devastating drain of the crystal. But it would be minutes before he could fight, maybe longer, and minutes were a luxury they did not have. Alara Vane was rising. Her shattered form was knitting itself back together, the shadows that made up her body flowing like liquid darkness, reforming into something that was almost human but not quite. Her face was a mask of fury, her black eyes fixed on Jae-Hyun with a hunger that made the air itself seem to curdle. The Directorate mages had regrouped around her, their spells ready, their wills bent to the purpose that had consumed them for 1,000 years. The ritual was broken, the seal was stabilizing, but the parasitic king was not so easily denied. "The crystal," Alara hissed, her voice a chorus of whispers that scraped against Jae-Hyun's mind like claws on stone. "You think that little trinket can stop what has been set in motion? You think 1,000 years of preparation can be undone by a single act of desperation?" She spread her arms, and the darkness that had been retreating began to surge forward again. Not the shadows of the ritual this time, but something older, something deeper. The walls of the grand hall began to crack, the enchanted glass of the dome shattering into a rain of deadly shards that fell like tears from a dying sky. The nobles screamed, the students wept, the professors who had not been part of the Directorate tried to fight, tried to flee, tried to do anything to escape the nightmare that had consumed their celebration. But there was no escape. The darkness was everywhere, and in the heart of that darkness, something was waking up. "The seal is breaking," Yoo-na said, her voice tight with fear. She had seen the truth of it before Jae-Hyun had, her instincts honed by years of combat, her senses sharpened by the power that burned in her blood. Not the ritual, the seal, the one the first monarch made. She's not trying to complete the harvest. She's trying to break it open completely. Jae-Hyun's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on the festival, on the ritual, on the 13 circles and the harvest and the vessel that Alara wanted him to become, that he had missed the larger truth. The ritual was not the endgame, it was the distraction. While he had been racing to destroy the focal point, while he had been using the crystal and draining his power, Alara had been doing something else, something worse. She had been opening the door. Below us, Jae-Hyun breathed, his eyes widening as the truth of it settled into his bones. She's not trying to summon the parasitic king into a vessel. She's trying to release it from the seal entirely. The ritual, the harvest, the vessels, they were never the goal. They were just preparation. A way to weaken the seal so that when the moment came, she could break it with a single strike. Yoo-na's face was pale, her flames flickering as the darkness pressed closer. And the crystal, you using the crystal, that was the moment, wasn't it? She needed the ritual to be disrupted. She needed the seal to be weakened in a specific way. She needed me. Jae-Hyun's voice was hollow. She needed the Monarch's power to interact with the seal. The crystal wasn't just a bomb, it was a key, and I handed it to her. Alara's laughter echoed across the grand hall, a sound that was not quite human, not quite anything that should exist in a world that still had hope in it. He understands. Finally, he understands. Did you think we did not know about the first monarch? Did you think we did not know he was waiting in the darkness, dreaming of the day when someone would come to free him? We have been waiting for that day too. Waiting for someone with the blood of the monarchs to touch the seal, to disrupt its perfect balance, to create the opening that we could never create ourselves. She stepped forward and the ground beneath her feet cracked, the stones splitting apart to reveal something that lay beneath the grand hall, something that had been waiting there for 1,000 years. Through the cracks, Jae-Hyun could see it, a vast darkness, a hunger that had no end, a presence that made his monarch's blood scream in his veins. The parasitic king, stirring in its prison, reaching toward the light. "You have done exactly what we needed you to do, Kang Jae-Hyun," Alara said, and her voice was almost gentle now, almost kind. "You have broken the seal that held us for 1,000 years. You have freed us from the prison that the first monarch built. And when we rise, when we consume this world and all the worlds beyond it, we will remember you, the one who made it all possible." The floor of the grand hall began to collapse. Not all at once, but in pieces, great chunks of stone falling into the darkness below, taking nobles and students and professors with them. Jae-Hyun heard their screams, heard their prayers, heard the sound of their bodies being swallowed by the hunger that had been waiting 1,000 years for this moment. He tried to move, tried to help, but his legs would not obey. His power was still gone, his strength still drained, his body still recovering from the crystal's toll. Yoo-na moved beside him, her flames lashing out, catching a group of students who were about to fall, pulling them back from the edge. She was fighting, even now, even when the darkness was rising and the king was waking and everything they had fought for was crumbling around them. She was fighting. But it was not enough. It would never be enough. There were too many people, too much chaos, too much darkness. And in the heart of that darkness, something was rising. Jae-Hyun saw it first. A shape in the shadow, vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond memory. It had no form that human eyes could properly perceive, no shape that human minds could fully comprehend. It was a mass of hunger and darkness, and the accumulated despair of 1,000 years of imprisonment. It was the parasitic king, freed at last from the seal that had held it for a millennium. And it was looking at him. He felt its attention like a physical weight, a pressure on his soul that made him want to fall to his knees to weep, to beg for mercy that would never come. The hunger in its gaze was absolute, infinite, the hunger of something that had been starved for 1,000 years and was finally being fed. "You," it said, and its voice was not a voice but a vibration that passed through his bones, his blood, his very being. "You are the one who freed me." Jae-Hyun could not answer. He could not breathe. He could not think. The weight of the king's attention was crushing him, pressing down on his soul, squeezing the hope out of him like water from a stone. "You are the one who broke the seal, who shattered the prison, who gave me back my freedom after 1,000 years of darkness." The king's form shifted, moved, began to coalesce into something that was almost recognizable. A face, perhaps, or the memory of a face. Something that had once been human before it had been consumed by the hunger that now defined it. "I will reward you for what you have done," the king said, and its voice was almost kind, almost gentle, almost something that might have been gratitude. "I will consume you last. You will watch as I devour everything you have ever known, everyone you have ever loved, everything you have ever tried to protect. And when there is nothing left but you and me and the darkness between the stars, I will let you die." It laughed, and the sound was the end of the world. Jae-Hyun felt something inside him crack. Not his power, not his strength, but something deeper. Something that had been holding him together since hell mode, since the seal broke, since he had first looked into the darkness and decided to fight. The hope that had carried him through 3 years of humiliation, through a month of hell, through the trials and the secrets and the impossible odds. The king's laughter was crushing that hope, grinding it to dust, leaving nothing but the cold, empty certainty that he had failed. "You can't." The voice was small, almost lost in the chaos of the collapsing hall and the rising darkness. But Jae-Hyun heard it. He heard it because he knew it, because it was the voice of someone who had never stopped fighting, who had never given up, who had never let the darkness win. Yoo-na stood between him and the king, her flames blazing brighter than he had ever seen them, her face streaked with tears and soot and the blood of a dozen small wounds. She was shaking. He could see it from where he stood, the tremors running through her body, the fear that was eating at her soul. But she was standing, she was fighting, she was refusing to let the darkness win. "You can't have him," she said, and her voice was stronger now, stronger than it had any right to be. "You can't have any of us. We didn't come this far to lose. We didn't fight this hard to give up. We are the students of Ars Magna. We are the ones who survived your trials, who broke your seals, who walked into hell and walked out again. And we are not afraid of you." She raised her hands, and the flames that surrounded her began to change. They were no longer just fire. They were something else, something that Jae-Hyun had never seen before, something that made the parasitic king pause in its advance. The flames were silver now, shot through with threads of gold and white, burning with a light that was not the light of destruction but the light of something else. The light of a soul that refused to be consumed. "You want to know what we are?" Yoo-na's voice was a roar now, a challenge thrown at the darkness that had been waiting 1,000 years to consume them all. "We are the ones who will not break. We are the ones who will not bow. We are the ones who will burn your darkness until there is nothing left but the light." She released the flames and they exploded outward, a wave of silver fire that swept across the grand hall, driving back the shadows, consuming the darkness, giving light to a place that had forgotten what light was. The parasitic king screamed, a sound that was not pain but something else, something that might have been surprise, might have been fear, might have been the first hint of doubt that it had felt in 1,000 years. And in that moment, in the heart of the chaos and the darkness and the rising tide of hunger that threatened to consume them all, Jae-Hyun felt his power return. It came back not as a flood, not as a wave, but as a spark, a tiny ember in the darkness of his soul, the first light after an eclipse, the first breath after drowning. He seized it, held it, fed it with everything he had, everything he was, everything he had ever been and ever would be. The monarch's blood woke. The chains that had bound him, the exhaustion that had drained him, the darkness that had tried to consume him, all of it fell away like a mask being torn from a face. He rose to his feet, and the power that flowed through him was not the power of the crystal, or the system, or even the monarch's blood. It was something older, something that had been waiting in the depths of his soul since the moment he had walked into hell mode with nothing left to lose. It was the power of a man who had spent 3 years being told he was nothing, and who had decided, in the depths of the darkest place on earth, that he would rather die than believe it. "Yoo-na," he said, and his voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who had already faced the end of the world and found it wanting. "Get everyone out. The students, the nobles, anyone who can still move. Get them out of here." She turned to look at him, and her eyes widened as she saw what he was becoming. The F-rank insignia on his chest was gone, shattered by the power that was rising within him. In its place, a symbol was forming, a mark that had not been seen in this world for 1,000 years. The black crown of a monarch rising above his head like a promise, like a warning, like the first light of a new dawn. "What are you going to do?" she asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. Jae-Hyun smiled, and it was not the smile of a student or a failure or a boy who had been humiliated for 3 years. It was the smile of a monarch who had walked through hell and returned with the power to remake the world. "I'm going to remind this king what it means to be afraid." He stepped forward, and the darkness that had been pressing against him, trying to consume him, trying to break him, recoiled. The parasitic king's attention was on him now, fully, completely, the hunger in its gaze replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. It had faced monarchs before. It had consumed them, broken them, fed on their power and their hope and their despair. But it had never faced one like this. One who had been forged in the fires of hell mode. One who had been broken and rebuilt and broken again, until there was nothing left but the will to survive. One who had been told He was nothing so many times that he had learned the truth that nothing could teach you. When you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to gain. You freed me, the king said, and its voice was uncertain now, probing, testing. You broke the seal, you gave me back my freedom, and now you would fight me. Now you would try to undo what you have done. I didn't free you, Jae-Hyun said, and his voice carried across the grand hall, across the chaos and the darkness and the fear that had gripped every heart in that place. I broke the seal that was holding you, but the seal was never what kept you prisoner. It was never what kept you contained. What kept you prisoner, what kept you contained, was the hope of the people you tried to consume. The hope that one day someone would come who was strong enough to fight you. The hope that one day the darkness would fall. He raised his hand, and the power that flowed through him began to take shape. Not fire, not light, not any of the elements that the mages of Ars Magna had spent their lives learning to control. Something older, something that had been waiting in the blood of the monarchs since the first of them had looked at the darkness and said, "No more." The power of a will that refused to break. And that hope, Jae-Hyun said, is still here. It was here in the first monarch when he gave his life to seal you away. It was here in Jin Sung-ho when he refused to become your vessel. It is here in Yoo-na when she stood against you even when she knew she could not win. It is here in every student, every professor, every person who looked at the darkness and decided that they would rather die than let it win. He stepped forward, and the darkness that was the king's body began to crack, to crumble, to fall away from the light that was rising within him. "You want to know why you have been in prison for 1,000 years?" he asked, and his voice was not angry now, not triumphant, not any of the things that the king had expected from a monarch. It was something else, something that the king had not heard in 1,000 years, something that it had forgotten existed. It was pity. Because you are afraid. You have always been afraid. You consume because you are empty, and you are empty because you have never understood that the one thing you cannot consume is the one thing that makes life worth living. Hope, courage, the will to stand against the darkness even when you know you cannot win. He raised his hand, and the power that had been building within him reached its peak. The black crown above his head blazed with a light that was not light, a fire that was not fire, a power that was not the power of destruction or creation, or any of the things that the mages of this world had spent their lives trying to understand. It was the power of a man who had been told he was nothing, and who had decided to become everything. "This ends now," Jae-Hyun said, "not with your destruction, not with your consumption, but with something you have never understood and never will, forgiveness." He released the power, and the grand hall was filled with light. It was not the light of the sun or the stars or any of the lights that humans had learned to create. It was the light of 1,000 years of hope, of courage, of the refusal to let the darkness win. It was the light of the first monarch who had given his life to protect a world that would forget him. It was the light of Jin Sung-ho, who had died alone so that others might live. It was the light of every student, every professor, every person who had ever looked at the darkness and said, "No more." And the parasitic king, the hunger that had consumed worlds, the darkness that had been waiting 1,000 years to be free, began to scream. It was not the scream of a predator or a conqueror or a king. It was the scream of something that had been empty for so long that it had forgotten what it meant to be full. It was the scream of something that had consumed so much that it had forgotten how to feel anything but hunger. It was the scream of something that was dying, not because it was being destroyed, but because it was being shown something it had never known and could never understand. Hoping. The light consumed the darkness. The hunger was pushed back, pushed down, pushed into the depths from which it had risen. The parasitic king's form began to collapse, to crumble, to fall away into nothing. And in the heart of that collapse, in the center of the light that was consuming the darkness, Jae-Hyun saw something that made his heart stop. A face, a human face. The face of something that had once been a person, before the hunger had consumed it, before the darkness had taken it, before it had become a king of emptiness and despair. And on that face, for just a moment, there was something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," a voice whispered, a voice that was not the chorus of the king, but something older, something that had been buried beneath 1,000 years of hunger. Thank you for freeing me." And then the light consumed it, and it was gone. The grand hall was silent. The darkness had receded, the shadows had fled, the hunger that had threatened to consume them all was gone. The floor was still cracked, the walls still shattered, the dome still open to the sky above. But the sun was rising, the first light of dawn breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the ruins of what had been a celebration. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of it all, his power fading, his strength draining, his body trembling with exhaustion. The black crown above his head was gone, the monarch's mark fading back into his blood. He was just a student again, just an F-rank, just a boy who had walked into hell and walked out again. But he was something else too, something that the world had not seen in 1,000 years. He was a monarch who had faced the darkness and won. Yoo-na was beside him in an instant, her hands on his arms, her face pale with fear and relief and a dozen other emotions that he could not name. Jae-Hyun, are you?" He smiled at her, and it was the smile of a man who had finally, after 3 years of darkness, found something worth living for. "I'm fine," he said. "We're all fine." Around them, the survivors of the Festival of Stars were beginning to rise, to move, to understand that they were still alive. The students who had been marked for sacrifice, the nobles who had come to celebrate, the professors who had not known the truth of what their academy had become. All of them were looking at Kang Jae-Hyun with something that he had never seen on their faces before. Respect. He had been the weakest, he had been the lowest, he had been the one that everyone forgot. But now, in the light of the rising sun, with the darkness defeated and the king consumed, he was something else. He was the one who had saved them all. He was the monarch who had returned from hell. He was the F-rank who had cleared the impossible and come back to tell the tale. He was Kang Jae-Hyun, and he was just getting started. But as the survivors began to gather around him, as Yoo-na's hand found his and held it tight, as the first cheers of relief and gratitude began to rise from the crowd, Jae-Hyun saw something that made his blood run cold. A message, floating in the air before him, visible only to his eyes, written in the same ancient script that had greeted him when he first emerged from hell mode. Tutorial phase complete. The Forgotten Monarch's Ascension, Stage 1 of 7. Congratulations, Kang Jae-Hyun. You have cleared the first trial. You have defeated the parasitic king's manifestation. You have proven yourself worthy of the power that flows in your blood. But the true hell mode has only just begun. The parasitic king you have defeated was not the true threat. It was a fragment, a seed, a test placed here by forces beyond your understanding to determine if you were worthy of what comes next. You have passed the test. You have proven yourself worthy. And now the true war begins. Welcome to the real hell mode, Kang Jae-Hyun. The war across dimensions begins now. The message faded, and Jae-Hyun stood in the light of the rising sun, his hand in Yoo-na's, the cheers of the survivors ringing in his ear, and knew that the battle he had just fought was only the beginning. The parasitic king was defeated, the Directorate was broken, the academy was saved. But somewhere in the darkness between worlds, something was watching, something that had been waiting for him to prove himself worthy, something that was even now preparing to test him in ways that hell mode had never prepared him for. He looked at Yoo-na, at her smile, at the relief in her eyes, and he could not bring himself to tell her, "Not yet. Let her have this moment. Let them all have this moment. There would be time enough for the truth later." But in his heart, in the depths of his soul, where the monarch's blood burned with a fire that would never die, Kang Jae-Hyun made a promise to the forces that were even now preparing to test him. He had cleared hell mode once. He would clear it again, and again, and again, for as many times as it took to protect the people he loved, to defend the world he had saved, to prove that the F-rank who had walked into hell with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous thing any king or demon or nightmare would ever face. The sun rose higher over Ars Magna Academy, and Kang Jae-Hyun stood in its light and waited for the darkness that was coming. He was ready. The silence that followed the parasitic king's defeat was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting to see what would come next. The survivors of the Festival of Stars stood in the shattered remains of the Grand Hall, their eyes fixed on the boy who had saved them, their hearts still racing with the memory of the darkness that had almost consumed them all. Jae-Hyun felt their gazes like a weight on his shoulders, but he could not afford to rest. The system's message was still burning in his mind, the words seared into his consciousness like a brand. The true hell mode has only just begun. He had thought the parasitic king was the end. He had thought that breaking the ritual, shattering the seal, consuming the darkness with the light of 1,000 years of hope would be enough. But the system was telling him that everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had endured in hell mode and the catacombs and the hidden floor, all of it was just the beginning. A tutorial, a test, a proving ground for something far greater than he had ever imagined. He looked around the grand hall, at the nobles weeping in relief, at the students clinging to each other, at the professors who were only now beginning to understand the depth of the Directorate's betrayal. They thought it was over. They thought the nightmare had ended. They did not know that the real nightmare was only beginning to stir. Yoo-na was at his side, her hand still gripping his, her flames reduced to a faint glow around her fingers. She was watching him, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. She had seen the message. He knew she had. The light of the system's words had been visible to her, even if she could not read the ancient script. She had seen something in his face when he read it, something that had made the relief in her eyes fade into something harder, something that looked like the acceptance of a soldier who had been told that the war was not over after all. "What did it say?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Jae-Hyun hesitated. He wanted to protect her from this. He wanted to give her one moment of peace, one moment of rest, one moment to believe that they had won. But he had learned in hell mode that lies were a luxury he could not afford. The truth was a weapon, and if they were going to survive what was coming, they needed to be armed with it. "It said we passed the tutorial," he said, and his voice was steady, even as the words felt like ashes in his mouth. The parasitic king was a test, a fragment, a seed planted here to see if we were worthy of what comes next. Yoo-na's face went pale, but she did not look away. "What comes next?" Jae-Hyun shook his head. "I don't know, but I know where to find out." He turned away from the survivors, from the chaos, from the questions that were already beginning to form on 100 lips. His legs were heavy, his body still drained from the crystal's toll, but he forced himself to move. There was no time to rest. There was no time to heal. There was only the next battle, the next trial, the next impossible thing he had to do to survive. Yoo-na followed him without a word. She always followed. They made their way through the ruined corridors of the academy, past the shattered windows and the broken walls, past the students who stared at them with eyes that held awe and fear in equal measure. The Directorate's influence was gone, its mages scattered or dead, its secrets laid bare for anyone who cared to look. But the academy itself was still standing, its ancient stones still pulsing with the power of 1,000 years of magic. And beneath it, in the darkness where the first monarch had been chained for a millennium, something was waiting. The entrance to the catacombs was where they had left it, behind the old chapel, hidden by wards that had been shattered in the chaos of the king's awakening. Jae-Hyun descended into the darkness without hesitation, his monarch's senses guiding him through the tunnels, past the chambers where he had hidden and planned and hoped, down into the depths where the light of the sun had never reached. Yoo-na walked beside him, her flames providing the only illumination in the absolute darkness. She did not ask where they were going. She did not ask what they would find. She simply walked, her hand occasionally brushing against his, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos that was threatening to consume him. The chamber where they had found the first monarch was unchanged, its walls still shimmering with the light of 1,000 runes, its center still occupied by the figure of the ancient king, who had given everything to save a world that had forgotten him. But the chains that had bound him were gone, shattered by his own power in the moment Jae-Hyun had needed him most. And he was awake. His eyes were open, and they were the eyes of a man who had seen the birth and death of stars, who had watched empires rise and fall, who had waited 1,000 years for the one who would finally finish what he had started. They were ancient, those eyes, and tired, and filled with a light that had not been extinguished by a millennium of darkness. "You came back," the first monarch said, and his voice was not the thunder of a king or the whisper of a ghost. It was the voice of a man who had been waiting for a very long time to say those words. Jae-Hyun knelt. It was not a gesture of submission, not the bow of a student to a master, but something else. Something that might have been respect, or gratitude, or the recognition of one warrior to another who had fought the same war and carried the same scars. "You said you would teach me," Jae-Hyun said. "When I came back, you said you had much to teach." The first monarch smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had not smiled in 1,000 years. "I did, and I will. But first, you must understand what it is you are asking to learn, what it is you are asking to become." He rose from the stone where he had been sitting, his movements slow, careful, the movements of a man whose body had forgotten what it was like to move at all. He was tall, taller than Jae-Hyun had expected, his frame gaunt with age and deprivation, but still carrying the echoes of the power that had once made him the greatest mage in human history. "The parasitic king you defeated was not the true enemy," he said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of a truth he had carried alone for 1,000 years. "It was a fragment, a seed, a weapon sent by something far older, far more powerful, far more patient than anything you have ever faced." He began to walk, circling the chamber, his feet leaving no marks on the shimmering floor. 1,000 years ago, when I sealed the parasitic king, I thought I was ending a war. I thought I was saving the world from a threat that would have consumed it. But I was wrong. I was delaying. I was buying time, because the parasitic king was not the invader. It was the scout. He stopped, turning to face Jae-Hyun, and for a moment his ancient eyes held something that might have been fear. "There are other worlds beyond this one, other dimensions, other realities, other versions of existence that have nothing in common with the world you know. And in those worlds, there are things that have been watching us for a very long time, waiting, preparing, testing." He gestured to the walls of the chamber, and the runes that covered them began to glow, to shift, to form images that Jae-Hyun had never seen before. Worlds of fire and ice, worlds of light and shadow, worlds that should not exist, that could not exist, that existed only in the spaces between reality where the laws of physics were suggestion, and the only constant was hunger. The parasitic king was one of their weapons, a creature designed to consume, to grow, to prepare a world for the harvest. "They seeded it here 1,000 years ago, and I stopped it. I sealed it away. I thought I had won." His voice hardened. "But I was a fool. The seal did not stop them. It only made them curious. They had never seen a world that could resist their weapons, a species that could fight back against the hunger. And so they began to watch, to study, to prepare." He looked at Jae-Hyun, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. The academy was not built to contain the parasitic king. It was built to find the one who could defeat, the one who could prove that humanity was worthy of surviving what was coming. The ranking system, the trials, the hidden floors, the secrets buried beneath the stones, all of it was designed to find the one who could do what I could not, who could finish what I started. He moved closer, and Jae-Hyun felt the weight of his presence like the pressure of deep ocean. "You have proven yourself, Kang Jae-Hyun. You have cleared the tutorial. You have shown that you have the will, the courage, the hope that is needed to face what is coming. But you are not ready, not yet, and you do not have time to become ready the way I did, the way the monarchs before me did." He reached out and placed his hand on Jae-Hyun's shoulder, and Jae-Hyun felt the power in that touch, the power of 1,000 years of waiting, of hopping, of dreaming of this moment. "I am going to teach you what it means to be a monarch, not the power you already have. I am going to teach you what to do with it, how to use it, how to become something that the things in the darkness have never seen before." Jae-Hyun met his eyes, and he did not look away. "How long will it take?" The first monarch smiled, and there was something in that smile that might have been pride. "In the world above, 3 days until the festival's aftermath is settled. 3 days until the survivors have gone home, and the academy has begun to rebuild. 3 days until the forces that have been watching decide whether to strike again." He stepped back, and the runes on the walls began to blaze with a light that was almost painful to behold. But in this place, in the heart of the seal that held the parasitic king for 1,000 years, time moves differently. 3 days above will be 3 months below, and in 3 months I will teach you everything I know. He raised his hands, and the chamber began to change. The walls expanded, the ceiling rose. The floor became something that was not stone but memory, not solid but possibility. And in the center of it all, where the chains had once bound the first monarch, a door was forming. A door that led to a place that Jae-Hyun had never seen but knew in his bones. Hell mode, replayed, remade, redesigned by the first monarch himself to prepare the one who would carry his legacy into the war that was coming. You cleared the Academy's hell mode, the first monarch said, and his voice was the voice of a teacher now, a mentor, a father to the son he had never had. But that was a pale imitation, a test designed by those who did not understand what hell mode was meant to be. I will show you the true hell mode, the one I created 1,000 years ago when I first understood what was coming, the one that will break you, remake you, forge you into something that even the kings in the darkness will fear. He looked at Yoo-na, who had been standing in silence throughout the exchange, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. You will come too. The monarch does not fight alone. That is the lesson that Jin Sung-ho learned too late. That is the lesson that I learned too late. The darkness can only be defeated by those who stand together. Yoo-na looked at Jae-Hyun, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the fear that she had been holding back since the moment she had first seen the parasitic king rise. But he saw something else too, something that had been there since the beginning, since the moment she had taken his hand in the storage room and promised to stand beside him. Determination. I'm ready, she said, and her voice did not waver. Jae-Hyun reached out and took her hand, and together they stepped through the door. Hell mode was not what he remembered. The dungeon he had cleared a month ago had been a place of darkness and pain, a labyrinth of monsters and traps designed to break anyone who entered it. But this place was different. This place was not a dungeon. It was a world. They stood on a plain of ash and fire, the sky above them a roiling mass of crimson clouds, the ground beneath their feet cracked and bleeding with the heat of 1,000 molten rivers. Mountains of obsidian rose in the distance, their peaks shrouded in smoke, their slopes crawling with things that moved in the shadows. And everywhere, there was the sense of something watching, something waiting, something that had been here for a very long time and would be here long after they were gone. What is this place? Yoo-na breathed, her flames flaring instinctively against the heat that pressed against them from all sides. The true hell mode, the first monarch's voice echoed around them, coming from everywhere and nowhere. A reflection of the world that lies beyond the seal, a glimpse of the darkness that is coming. I built this place 1,000 years ago, using the power of the parasitic king's prison to create a training ground for the one who would come after me. I have been maintaining it ever since, waiting for someone worthy to enter. His form coalesced before them, not the gaunt figure of the chained king, but something younger, something that still carried the fire of the man who had faced the parasitic king and refused to break. He was armored now, his ancient robes replaced by plates of black steel that gleamed with the light of 1,000 runes, his hands wrapped around a sword that seemed to drink the light from the sky. This place will test you in ways that the Academy's hell mode never could. It will break your body, your mind, your soul. It will show you your deepest fears, your darkest secrets, your greatest weaknesses, and it will give you a choice: break or become something stronger than you have ever been. He raised his sword and the sky answered. Lightning crackled across the crimson clouds, thunder rolled across the plain of ash, and from the mountains in the distance, something began to move. Something vast, something ancient, something that had been waiting for 1,000 years to be unleashed. The first trial is simple: survive. The ground beneath their feet erupted. Jae-Hyun moved on instinct, his body responding to the threat before his mind had fully processed it. He grabbed Yoo-na and threw them both to the side, rolling across the ash as a pillar of fire exploded from the spot where they had been standing. The heat was incredible, enough to melt stone, enough to vaporize flesh, enough to kill anything that was not protected by the power of a monarch. but Yi Hyun was protected. His monarch's blood was burning in his veins, his body already beginning to heal from the burns that covered his arms, his skin already beginning to harden against the heat that pressed against them from every direction. Yoo-na was not so lucky. He saw the pain in her face, the burns that were already forming on her hands, the way her flames flickered and died against the heat that was trying to consume her. She was strong, stronger than any student in the academy, but she was not a monarch. She did not have his regeneration, his resistance, his power. He had to protect her. He had to get her out of here. He had to. No. Her voice was fierce, cutting through his panic like a blade. She pushed herself to her feet, her hands trembling, her face streaked with ash and blood, but her eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with her magic. "I didn't come this far to be carried," she said, and her voice was the voice of the Crimson Princess, the S-rank prodigy, the girl who had never lost a single match in her entire academic career. "I came to fight, so fight with me, not for me." She raised her hands and her flames erupted, not the silver fire she had used against the parasitic king, but something older, something that had been in her blood since the day she was born. Fire that burned with the heat of a star, fire that pushed back the heat of the Hell Mode, fire that made the first monarch, standing on the ridge above them, smile with something that might have been approval. Yi Hyun looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the flames on her hands, the determination that had carried her through everything the world had thrown at her. And he understood in that moment what the first monarch had been trying to teach him. He did not need to protect her. He needed to fight beside her. He turned to face the thing that was rising from the mountain, the vast shape that was even now crossing the plain of ash, its shadow falling over them like the shadow of death itself. It was a creature of fire and stone, a golem the size of a mountain, its body formed from the very substance of this world, its eyes blazing with the light of 1,000 furnaces. And Yi Hyun smiled. "This is Hell Mode," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had faced the darkness and won, who had walked through fire and come out the other side, who had been broken and rebuilt and broken again until there was nothing left but the will to survive. "This is what I was made for." He raised his hand, and the monarch's power flowed through him like a river, like an ocean, like the fire that was burning in Yoo-na's hands and the light that was blazing in the first monarch's eyes, and the hope that had carried him through everything he had ever faced. He had cleared Hell Mode once. He would clear it again, and again, and again, for as many times as it took to protect the people he loved, to defend the world he had saved, to prove that the F-rank who had walked into hell with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous thing any king or demon or nightmare would ever face. The golem roared, and Yi Hyun charged to meet it. Behind him, Yoo-na's flames blazed like a second sun, and above them, on the ridge of ash and obsidian, the first monarch watched with eyes that held the light of 1,000 years of waiting, of hopping, of believing that someone, someday, would come who was worthy of carrying his legacy into the darkness. The true Hell Mode had begun, and Kang Jae-Hyun, the weakest student in the history of Ars Magna Academy, was going to show the kings who was really afraid. 3 months in Hell Mode, 3 months of fire and ash, of battles that pushed him to the edge of death and beyond, of lessons taught in blood and pain, and the slow, agonizing process of becoming something more than human. 3 months of fighting beside Yoo-na, of learning to trust her with his life and she with hers, of forging a bond that no force in any dimension could break. And now, finally, it was over. Yi Hyun stood at the edge of the plain of ash, his body scarred and transformed, his eyes burning with a light that had not been there when he first entered this place. The black crown of the monarch floated above his head, no longer a flickering shadow but a solid thing, a mark of authority that the very fabric of this world recognized and obeyed. His F-rank insignia was gone, shattered in the first week of training, replaced by nothing. He did not need a rank. He was beyond ranks. He was something that the Academy's ranking system had never been designed to measure. Beside him, Yoo-na was changed too. Her crimson hair was streaked with silver now, the mark of the power she had awakened in the depths of Hell Mode, The fire that burned in her blood no longer just the inheritance of her family line, but something new, something that had been forged in the crucible of this place and tempered by her own will. She was no longer just the Crimson Princess. She was something that had never existed before. A mortal who had walked through hell and emerged with the fire of a king burning in her veins. The first monarch stood before them, his form flickering at the edges, his thousand-year vigil finally coming to an end. He had given them everything he had, everything he was, everything he had been saving for the one who would come after him. And now, as the sun, the real sun, the sun of the world above, began to pierce the crimson clouds of hell mode for the first time in 1,000 years, he was finally allowed to rest. "You have done what I could not," he said, and his voice was soft, almost gentle, the voice of a father speaking to his children on the day they left home. "You have faced the darkness and refused to break. You have carried the weight of 1,000 years of hope and made it your own. You are ready." He looked at Jae-Hyun, and there was pride in his eyes, pride in something that might have been love. "The war that is coming will test you in ways that this place never could. You will face enemies who have been preparing for this moment since before humanity learned to walk upright. You will face losses that will make you want to give up, to surrender, to let the darkness take you. But you will not break. You have been broken before, and you have always, always risen." He turned to Yoo-na, and his smile widened. "And you who had no monarch's blood, no ancient legacy, no destiny written in the stars. You chose to walk into hell beside a man you barely knew, to fight a war that was not yours, to become something that no prophecy ever foretold. You are the reason he will succeed where I failed. You are the fire that will light the darkness." He raised his hand, and the world around them began to dissolve, the plain of ash fading into mist, the crimson clouds parting to reveal a sky that was blue and gold and beautiful beyond words. Hell mode was ending, its purpose fulfilled, its power finally spent after 1,000 years of waiting. "The gate will open in a moment," the first monarch said. "You will return to the academy. 3 days will have passed as I promised. The survivors will be rebuilding. The world will be healing, and you will have a choice to make. You can live the lives you were meant to live before the darkness found you. You can be students again, children again, free of the weight of what you have learned and what you have become." He looked at them both, and his eyes held the weight of 1,000 years of knowing. "Or you can prepare for the war that is coming. You can train. You can grow. You can become the warriors that this world will need when the true darkness finally arrives. The choice is yours. You have earned the right to make it." The mist was thickening, the light growing brighter, the world above reaching down to pull them back to the lives they had left behind. Jae-Hyun felt the pull of it, the call of the sun and the air, and the simple, precious normalcy of a world that did not know it was standing on the edge of an abyss. He looked at Yoo-na, and she looked at him, and they did not need to speak. They had spent 3 months in hell mode learning to communicate without words, to trust without doubt, to fight as one being with 2 bodies and 2 souls. They had made their choice a long time ago. "We'll be ready," Jae-Hyun said, and his voice was the voice of a monarch, certain and calm, carrying the weight of a promise that he would keep or die trying. "When the darkness comes, we'll be waiting." The first monarch smiled, and for a moment he was young again, young and strong and full of the fire that had made him the greatest mage in human history. "I know you will." And then the light consumed them, and hell mode was gone. The sun was setting over Ars Magna Academy when Jae-Hyun opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor of the Grand Hall, the same floor where he had faced the parasitic king 3 days ago, the same floor that was now covered in scaffolding and half-repaired stone. The survivors had been busy. The shattered walls were being rebuilt. The broken dome was being replaced. The darkness that had consumed this place was being pushed back by the simple, stubborn determination of people who refused to let the nightmare define them. He sat up slowly, his body aching in ways that had nothing to do with the 3 months of training he had just endured. The scars of hell mode were fading, but the memory of it would never leave him. He did not want it to. The memory was a weapon, a shield, a reminder of what he had become and what he was fighting for. Beside him, Yoo-na was already on her feet, her eyes scanning the hall, her flames flickering at her fingertips. She was ready. She was always ready now. The fire in her blood had been awakened, and it would never sleep again. Jae-Hyun. The voice came from behind him, and he turned to see Professor Min standing at the edge of the reconstruction, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not contempt, not dismissal, not the cold, clinical assessment of a professor evaluating a student who had failed to meet her standards. Fear and something else, something that might have been respect. "The directorate is gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The headmaster, what he became, we didn't know. None of us knew. We thought the directorate was just a governing body, a group of senior professors who made the decisions that kept the academy running. We didn't know what they were planning. We didn't know what they had been doing for 1,000 years." She looked at the ground and her voice cracked. "We didn't know about the students, the ones who disappeared, the ones who were harvested. We thought they had dropped out, transferred, moved on to better things. We didn't ask questions, we didn't want to know." Jae-Hyun looked at her, at the guilt and shame that were written on her face, and he felt something that surprised him. Not anger, not contempt, pity. She had been a tool of the directorate, yes. She had humiliated him, dismissed him, stripped him of everything he had. But she had not known what she was doing. She had been as blind as everyone else, as blind as he had been, before Hell Mode had opened his eyes. "What happens now?" he asked. Professor Min looked up and her eyes were wet. "The academy is in chaos. The ranking system is being questioned. Students are demanding answers. The families of the students who were taken, they want justice. They want someone to blame. The professors who were part of the directorate are being arrested, questioned, held accountable for what they did. But there are so many questions and so few answers. And everyone," she hesitated, "everyone is asking about you." She took a step closer and her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're saying you're the one who saved us, the F rank, the weakest student in the academy. They're saying you walked into Hell Mode and came back with the power of a king. They're saying you faced the darkness and won. They're saying," she stopped, swallowing hard, "they're saying you're a monarch, one of the old ones, the kind of mage that hasn't been seen in 1,000 years. Jae-Hyun was silent for a long moment. He could feel the weight of her words, the weight of what they meant. He had spent 3 years being the lowest, the weakest, the one that everyone forgot. And now, in the space of a single day, he had become something else. Something that people would look at with fear and hope, and the desperate need for someone to save them from the darkness that was coming. He did not want that weight. He had never wanted it. He had walked into Hell Mode because he had nothing left to lose, because the world had given him nothing, and he had decided that he would rather die fighting than live as nothing. He had not done it to become a hero. He had done it because it was the only choice he had. But choices had consequences. And the consequence of walking into Hell Mode and coming back alive was that people would look at him and see something that he had never asked to be. "I'm not a hero," he said, and his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "I'm just someone who refused to give up. That's all any of us can be." Professor Min stared at him for a moment, and then, slowly, she smiled. It was not the smile of a professor to a student, or a superior to an inferior. It was the smile of one person to another, a recognition of something that went beyond rank or status, or the arbitrary labels that the academy had spent 1,000 years teaching people to value. "That's exactly what a hero would say," she said. And then she turned and walked away, leaving Jae-Hyun alone with the setting sun and the weight of a world that was looking to him for answers he did not have. He found Yoo-na in the old storage room, the place where they had first made their alliance, where they had planned and hoped and dreamed of a future that had seemed so impossible. She was sitting on the crate where he had sat when he first told her the truth, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on the wall as if she could see through it, through the academy, through the world itself, to the darkness that was waiting beyond. "You're thinking about what comes next," he said, closing the door behind him. She did not turn. "I'm thinking about what the first monarch said, about the war that's coming, about the things that have been watching us for 1,000 years, waiting for the right moment to strike." She paused and her voice was small, almost fragile. "I'm thinking about whether we can win." Jae-Hyun moved to stand beside her, looking at the wall that she was looking at. seeing the same darkness that she was seeing. I don't know if we can win. I don't know if anyone can win against something that has been preparing for this moment since before humanity existed. But I know that we can fight. I know that we can make them bleed for every inch of ground they try to take. I know that we can be the reason that the darkness hesitates, even for a moment, even for a second, before it tries to consume us. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and for a moment, they were just two students sitting in a storage room, two people who had been given power they did not ask for and responsibilities they did not want. But they were also something more, something that the Directorate had not planned for, something that the darkness had not expected. They were the ones who had walked into hell and walked out again. They were the ones who had faced the end of the world and refused to blink. They were the ones who had been broken and rebuilt and broken again, until there was nothing left but the will to survive. And that will, that stubborn, impossible, ridiculous will, was the one thing that the darkness had never learned to defeat. "I'm scared," Yoo-na said, and her voice was honest in a way that it had never been before, not even in the depths of hell mode. "I've been scared since the moment I saw the parasitic king rise. I've been scared since the moment I realized that the world I thought I knew was a lie. I've been scared since the moment I understood that the power I spent my whole life building might not be enough to protect the people I care about." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold against his, her grip tight. "But I'm not going to run. I'm not going to hide. I'm going to stand here beside you and I'm going to fight. Because that's what we do. That's what we've always done. We fight. We survive. We win." Jae-Hyun squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the strength of her grip, the fire that burned in her blood and would never go out. "Together," he said. She smiled, and it was the smile of the Crimson Princess, the S-rank prodigy, the girl who had never lost a match and never would. Together. The days that followed were a blur of change. The academy was rebuilding, not just its walls and its towers, but its soul. The ranking system that had governed every aspect of student life for 1,000 years was being dismantled, replaced by something that the professors were still trying to define. The Directorate's secrets were being exposed, its crimes laid bare, its members brought to justice. The students who had been marked for sacrifice were being healed, their bodies and minds slowly recovering from the damage that had been done to them. And at the center of it all, watching it happen, was Kang Jae-Hyun. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not want it. He had spent 3 years being invisible, and he had learned the value of being overlooked. But the world was not willing to overlook him anymore. The students looked at him with awe, the professors with respect, the survivors with gratitude that bordered on worship. He was the one who had saved them. He was the one who had faced the darkness and won. He was the one who had proven that the weakest student in the academy was, in fact, the strongest. He did not know how to be that person. He did not know how to be a hero. He was just a boy who had walked into hell because he had nothing left to lose, who had fought because fighting was the only thing he knew how to do, who had won because losing was not an option. But he was learning. Every day he was learning to accept the gratitude without letting it change him, to carry the weight of expectation without letting it crush him, to be the monarch that the first monarch had believed he could be, without losing the boy who had walked into hell mode with nothing but hope in his heart. And at night, when the academy was quiet and the stars were bright and the world was sleeping, he trained. He practiced the skills that the first monarch had taught him, honed the power that burned in his blood, prepared for the war that he knew was coming. Because the system's message had been clear. The parasitic king was just the beginning. The true darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, preparing. And when it came, Kang Jae-Hyun would be ready. 1 month after the Festival of Stars, Jae-Hyun stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea, the same cliffs where he had trained in the days before the Directorate's fall, before hell mode, before everything had changed. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of the dawn after the parasitic king's defeat, the dawn that had promised a new beginning. Yoo-na stood beside him, her crimson hair streaked with silver, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had changed too, in ways that went deeper than the scars and the silver streaks and the power that burned in her blood. She had learned to trust, to rely on others, to let herself be vulnerable without losing her strength. She was no longer the Crimson Princess, the untouchable queen of the academy. She was something more, something that the world had never seen before. "The system hasn't said anything since we left Hell Mode," she said, her voice quiet in the morning air. "No messages, no warnings, no quests, just silence." Jae-Hyun nodded. "It's waiting, watching, seeing what we do next." "And what are we going to do next?" He looked at the horizon, at the sun rising over the sea, at the world that was healing and growing and preparing for the darkness that was coming. He thought about the first monarch, who had waited 1,000 years for someone to finish what he started. He thought about Jin Sung-ho, who had died alone because he did not know how to trust. He thought about the students who had been harvested, the professors who had been corrupted, the innocent people who had been caught in a war they did not even know existed. He thought about himself, Kang Jae-Hyun, the F-rank, the failure, the boy who had walked into Hell Mode with nothing left to lose and walked out with the power of a monarch in his blood. "We're going to be ready," he said. "We're going to train. We're going to grow. We're going to become the warriors that this world needs when the darkness finally comes. And when it does, when the true Hell Mode begins, we're going to show them what happens when you try to consume a world that has learned to fight back." He turned to look at Yoo-na, and she was smiling, that same fierce smile that had been there in the Grand Hall when she had stood against the parasitic king, that same determination that had carried her through Hell Mode and made her something that no prophecy had ever foretold. "And we're going to do it together," she said. He smiled back, "Together." The sun rose higher over Ars Magna Academy, over the world that was healing, over the darkness that was waiting. And Kang Jae-Hyun, the weakest student in the history of the academy, the F-rank who had cleared Hell Mode, the monarch who had returned from the dead to save a world that had forgotten him, stood on the cliffs and watched the new day begin. He did not know what was coming. He did not know if he was strong enough to face it. He did not know if the world was ready for the war that was about to begin. But he knew one thing. He knew it with a certainty that had been forged in the fires of Hell Mode, tempered in the darkness of the catacombs, and sealed in the light of 1,000 years of hope. He was ready. He had always been ready. And when the darkness came, when the true Hell Mode began, when the forces that had been watching for 1,000 years finally made their move, Kang Jae-Hyun would be there, standing on the edge of the abyss, looking into the darkness with eyes that had seen the worst the universe had to offer and refused to blink. The weakest student in the academy, the F-rank who had cleared Hell Mode, the monarch who had returned from the dead to save a world that had forgotten him. And he was just getting started.